Julian Solar is out in his prized white Mustang, ready to celebrate his 23rd birthday.
We had a conversation, and he was telling me, I'm gonna go and hang out with some friends. We're gonna celebrate my birthday tonight.
Friend Kenya Duran is joining Julian for the celebrations.
The minute she was born, it was like, she was like a ray of light. She had this infectious smile, always.
Kenya is a mom to a 6-year-old son.
And as a mother, she was an excellent mother. As young as she was, because she had him when she was 18, to her, it was like, this is my life, and this is what I'm gonna do, and I love him, and I'll take care of him forever.
Have a great time. Remember to call me. I will. See you later. Bye.
Julian and Kenya both share a passion for cars.
From a very young age, he loved cars. He was just so into like all kinds of cars, of course, racing cars. They both had a love of Mustangs, and that's what brought them together.
Julian and Kenya meet up with friends at a local car meet.
Hey, guys.
Hey, look at this dude. Hey, man. Happy birthday, bro. I mean, so far, so good.
This is like the perfect evening to talk about the car, show the car, see somebody else's car, and see what they've done in comparison to yours.
Smile. Nice. Okay.
They did photo shoots of their vehicles for their little clubs and things like that. Because they wanted eventually someday to have it, shown in a magazine or something. It was their moment, young people moments. As a parent, I think you always worry. There's always a sense of uneasiness when your kids go out, But we never had any problems. We never had any issues.
Miami-Dade County Police and Fire. What's the address of your
Yes, I just saw a shooting right now. Oh my God.
What's the address?
Oh, the mobile gas station is that? The mobile gas station.
Sir, has anyone been shot?
There's people on the floor. There's people on the floor. There's a guy in a Mustang and a white Mustang on the floor, and there's somebody and it was a black guy shooting.
All right, that's fine. We already have help on the way, okay?
Okay, man. Thank you.
Anytime there's shots fired, we'll get a large amount of 911 calls.
What's the problem there?
They shot him. I saw the whole shooting.
I need you to calm down. They're on the way out there. Is this a house or a business?
There's a gasoline station.
What's the name of the gas station?
Mother.
Okay, they're on the way.
I got that phone call from my sergeant requesting that I respond to the scene. I know the location. I start hypothesizing. I start thinking what the scene is going to look like, what I need to think about. I start running scenarios through my head. It gives you an understanding and helps calm you. When I first pull up to the gas station, I exit my vehicle and I take a deep breath. I've made my approach and I see a deceased individual. And I see his vehicle there. The female victim was actually alive. She was speaking to fire rescue. She was shot. She was suffering from an apparent gunshot wound to her flank. She would be able to give a description of the perpetrators in this case. I learned during the briefing that the victims were identified. The first, Julian, was identified through his driver's license, and Kenya was also identified.
While Kenya is rushed to hospital, Detective Zellner begins processing the scene.
I make my way to Julian. I take a look at him and I see multiple gunshot wounds. I do see some other physical evidence laying around by him, spent casings, stuff like that. Why did this person get shot so many times? What caused it?
Detectives question the gas station clerk.
The clerk is actually inside the store when he heard the gunfire. And that's what first caused him to turn. That's when he sees the SUV speed off and head north through the parking lot. He was not able to identify anybody. He said that he probably wouldn't be able to pick anybody out of a photographic lineup. While I'm doing the walkthrough as the lead detective, you always want to document where those closed-circuit TVs, those cameras are located.
The exterior cameras cover the gas station forecourt.
It was the number one question. Are the cameras working?
Can you take the tape to around 12:30 a.m.?
So what happened? At that point, then, I want to see it for myself. You could see the cameras were focused on the gas pump that we needed it to be.
There, that's the Mustang.
The victim pulls up to the gas pump, just a normal, everyday person filling up his vehicle. I observe a SUV-like vehicle pull into the gas station off of 57th Avenue very, very quickly. Almost as if it was going to drive by and see something and wants to turn in. As that vehicle turns in, it comes to an abrupt stop. 3 individuals exit that vehicle quickly, make their way to the victims. One of the subjects, the smaller of the 3, actually makes contact with the driver, and the 2 others make contact with the female victim. It looked extremely organized. It looked exactly where each one knew where they were going and who they were going to deal with. I thought it was extremely well orchestrated. To know that you're going to watch someone's life get taken. As a homicide detective, it's the most important part, but it's one of the most difficult parts to deal with. I observe him confront the male victim, and what I know at this point, shoots him multiple times. I didn't see the victims at any point put up a struggle to cause these individuals to shoot. But I gather from that point that something set the smaller of the 3 offenders off to cause him to take Julian's life. Kenya kind of is just on the side of the vehicle, on the passenger side, and she's shot. And it's like almost a reflex shoot. Maybe because they didn't want a witness.
Detective Zellner attempts to identify the suspect's vehicle.
Can you switch to the other camera? Stop.
Is it a Nissan? Is it a Pathfinder?
Can't make it out.
Unfortunately, we're not going to get that tag.
This wasn't the high-definition video that everyone would like to see. It was quite grainy.
Detective Zellner rewatches the footage.
Can we switch back to the first camera again? Rewind it to when the suspects get out. Okay, stop it right there. Play. Stop there. Zoom in.
I see that an individual, the shorter of the males, ends up grabbing the door handle area, touching the door handle area of the victim's Mustang. This is the biggest piece of evidence I have at this point in this investigation.
They immediately preserve that door. They take the fingerprints so that they can be used to compare to someone else's actual fingerprints.
While I'm on scene working,
Zellner.
I'm notified
She didn't make it.
Kenya ends up passing at the hospital.
Okay, thank you.
It's very devastating. As a human, when you're told that another human's life's been taken, it obviously affects you.
It means that the one witness that you have in the case is no longer alive, and so you can't depend on that person to give you any information.
I knew that now I have two victims that are no longer with us, and now I want to say pressure to solve this case is on me, and I need to solve it.
All of a sudden, I woke up. It was midnight. I hadn't heard her come in. I went to her bedroom. And she wasn't there. All of a sudden, I felt like this kind of uneasy feeling. I said, that's so strange. And she didn't call. She would always call me. She would always text me.
With no word from Kenya, Jackie checks the local news.
Came out of the car with his hands up, and still he shot him. Authorities are calling them senseless.
The first thing that was on the news was Julian's car, the Mustang. And they said there was a homicide at a gas station, and they were saying that the female victim was taken to the hospital.
Hello, yes?
I tried calling the Ryder Trauma Center, and they wouldn't give me any information. So I was thinking, no, it was just, nothing happened. It was just gonna be okay, it's just gonna be okay. But, no, it wasn't that way.
I'm asleep. It's about 5 in the morning. And it's never good when you have a knock on the door at 5 in the morning.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm Detective Zellner. This is Detective Wagaman. May we come in, please? Thank you.
One of the worst things that we can ever do as a law enforcement officer is we'd have to go make contact with a family in the middle of the night, wake them up and tell them that their loved one is no longer with them.
I looked at him and I said, shooting? What do you mean? I just felt like somebody knocked me out. Somebody punched me in the stomach, knocked me out. The worst possible thing that a parent could ever hear is that your child is gone. Your brain just cannot register that your child is gone. It doesn't, and it can't. For a long time, it didn't.
Detective Zellner receives a new lead.
We're told that there's a vehicle that's been located that is fully engulfed, and I hear the location go out. And the location immediately, it causes my suspicion. We're talking about a fully engulfed SUV vehicle matching the description of a car that just fled from the scene of a homicide.
The car is found burning in the Miami Gardens area. Of course, we know that it's been burnt to obviously get rid of any evidence. You know, we're not going to get any fingerprints. We're not going to get any DNA.
If there's anything that I'm going to get from that scene, it's most likely been destroyed. Fire did damage most of the particulars in the license plate, and they were unreadable. We were able to identify the vehicle via its VIN, vehicle identification number. We run that VIN through our database, and we learned that it was a green Nissan Pathfinder and who the owner was, and we also learned that it was reported stolen.
Detective Zellner visits the owner of the Pathfinder.
He was out of town, and while he was gone, this vehicle was taken, and he has some evidence, such as closed-circuit TV, that can maybe help with the investigation.
Can you go ahead and press play?
Anytime we're notified that there's possibly video footage of an incident, as a homicide detective, we're praying that there is going to be a face, and we're going to know who that person is. I see that individuals approach the vehicle, they actually enter the vehicle, and they steal the vehicle out of the yard of the complainant's home. You see them back it up and then put it on the street and then leave the area. Damn. The problem with the video, with the light being there, it's burning constantly, and it's actually causing the resolution of the video to be affected. It doesn't reveal anything that's going to say this is the person who stole the vehicle. We're not going to see that face. We don't have that close up.
In the hunt for suspects, investigators switch focus to their victims.
During an investigation, in any homicide investigation, we always want to take a look at our victims' pasts and present. We want to see, are they involved in any type of criminal activities? Have they been arrested? Are they out there committing crimes? I could not find anything that would show that either victim was involved in any type of criminal activity or had committed any type of criminal activity.
Generally, when there's some sort of homicide where there's been overkill, meaning a lot of bullets fired at the victim, it's usually personal. It's usually the perpetrator knows the victim. When we realized that there was no vendetta against Kenya or Julian, it really actually made the investigation harder because there wasn't anything to follow up on.
The Miami Gardens Police Department is currently investigating the brutal murder of one Julian Zoller and one Kenya Duran.
Janine and Jackie appeal to the public for any information that might lead to the shooters.
Being in front of all those people, strange people, you know, and talking about a very difficult subject, but it's something that you know you have to push through because it has to be done.
I was still in shock from everything that had happened because these were two innocent people that were just shot.
Investigators discover on the same night Julian and Kenya are shot, a distressed 911 call is made to police dispatch.
Tell me what happened. I just got out of the ATM and 3 guys just jumped in my car with a Uzi and 2 Glocks. They took my gun, they took everything.
They took my purse.
What's your name? It's Mario Rivas. You want it white or black? 3 African Americans. Okay, we're on our way. Okay, thank you.
There was an armed carjacking less than 20 minutes prior to the murder at the gas station.
Victim Mario Rivas is brought in for questioning.
Okay, sir. In your words, what I'd like you to do, if you could tell me what took place, like where did you go and what happened?
From the beginning?
Okay, including now. Pretty much Wednesday at 8 p.m.
They were at a casino. They had won some money. They were making a deposit at the ATM. They were in a high-end vehicle, which was an Escalade. The green Nissan Pathfinder pulls directly in front of their vehicle and blocks their path so they cannot exit. They are blocked in and they have nowhere to flee.
So he banged three windows and said, open it. They were on my side towards my drive. And all I was going to get him right. And at that moment, he tried to jump in the car.
Mr. Rivas is robbed, but Mrs. Rivas is held at gunpoint and forcefully taken out of the vehicle and placed on the ground.
The attackers drive off in the Rivas' vehicle, closely followed by the stolen Pathfinder.
I'm 100%, there's no doubt in my mind that that's the vehicle that ends up going up to kill Julianne and Kenya.
3 days later, Detective Zellner receives a tip from a fellow investigator.
Detective Zellner.
Detective approaches me and says that he might have information regarding a call that he responded to on individuals that were allegedly firing firearms in a residential area weeks before this crime.
The location of the incident isn't far from where the stolen green Nissan was found.
When they arrive on scene, there's individuals seen fleeing from officers. They're able to locate these individuals, and they're able to locate a firearm.
Police arrest 15-year-old Eric Ellington, 18-year-old Wayne Williams, and 16-year-old Dylan McFarland, but they are released later that day.
It could be the lucky break that I'm looking for. It's a lead that is going to possibly point me to who the individuals are that were involved in this double murder investigation.
Detective Zellner.
I'm actually notified that Dylan McFarland is going to be brought into the Miami Gardens Police Department on an unrelated case, burglary.
All right, thank you.
It's my opportunity to get to know an individual that I'm investigating for double murder, armed carjacking, arson, and a robbery.
What was your whereabouts on the evening of July 25th?
He has an alibi. He says he's actually at home playing video games. And he never leaves. That he's there and he knows nothing what I'm talking about.
Do you have any affiliation with a Eric Ellington or a Wayne Williams?
No. He doesn't even bat an eye, blink an eye. He just tells me that he does not know these individuals. I know that this is false 100% because I have a detective in another unit who has dealt with him and did a field interview card with him, placing all 3 of them on a scene where shots were fired and they fled from officers. He acts as if I'm speaking another language to him.
Detective Zellner also has Wayne Williams brought to the station.
We wanted to question him about the homicide and the carjacking of the Rivases.
I want them to see each other. I want them to know that they're both in the interview rooms, separate interview rooms at the time, but I want them to know that I got both of them. It's an investigative tool that homicide detectives might use, and I want to see their reaction when they see each other.
They pretend like they don't know one another. Of course, Detective Zellner knows this isn't true.
The look is, please don't say anything. I hope you're not saying anything.
Detective Zellner sits down with Wayne Williams.
Do you happen to know Dylan McFarland or an Eric Ellington?
I have no idea who those guys are.
What was your whereabouts on the evening of July 25th?
They both stick to alibis that they weren't anywhere near the murder, that they weren't anywhere where the robberies occurred, that one was playing video games, the other was at his house.
With both suspects denying they know each other, Detective Zellner looks for another connection.
After the interview, I end up looking at his phone, and his phone reveals that he does know Wayne Williams, because Wayne Williams' contact information is actually in his phone. It's plain as day. It is right there for anyone's eyes. You just have to scroll down to the number under the name, and he's located right there. At this point, I know that they're lying. I know that they have been untruthful the whole entire interview. I know this, and I knew this going into it. If I wasn't going to get a confession out of them at this particular moment, that I was going to have to let them go.
Detectives show Mario Rivas a photo lineup of the potential suspects to find out if they robbed his car.
Did I sneak you initial that you selected photo number 6? Yep. Is there anything else that you can maybe add? No, that's pretty much. Okay.
Mario is able to sort of narrow it down to 2 people in the lineup. One of them is Wayne Williams, and then another one is one of these random photographs of people that are unrelated to him, but wasn't able to go any further than that.
Jackie and Janine wait for news on the case.
I wanted them to get caught. I just wanted them to get caught so badly.
Still nothing? Okay, Detective, thanks for calling.
I don't think I could go on knowing that they could just get away with murdering people, with murdering our kids.
You're fighting, like half of you is already seeing all the evidence, your child is gone, and the other half is saying, no, it's not true, it's not true. He's gonna walk in through that door, and it's gonna be as it always was.
Detective Zellner.
I received a phone call from the Leighton Print Examiner that the print that we lifted from Julian Solera's white Mustang comes back as a match, 100%. It is nobody else's fingerprint except Eric Ellington's.
And the carjacking?
He also identifies the slap mark on the Rivas's Escalade on the passenger side window to match Eric Ellington.
All right, thank you.
Eric Ellington is brought in for questioning. He is 15 years old.
When you are interviewing a juvenile, you don't want to be too aggressive because you're an adult, and then you're also a law enforcement officer. So you want to be able to put the juvenile sort of at ease, to understanding that they're there to be spoken to.
Please tell the truth. That's simple. On Sunday, you don't know nothing about your green truck. And you're being honest with me. Talk to me about that station on 57th Avenue and 57th Street. What gas station? The mobile gas station.
Eric has an alibi. I believe he says he's at home playing video games, hanging out on the computer, just hanging out. He has no knowledge of what I'm speaking about. He does not know about a double murder. He does not know about any crimes committed. He knows nothing.
But what white Mustang?
Detective Zellner applies pressure to the suspect.
Explain to me how your prints got on the white Mustang. My prints wasn't on the white Mustang. I wouldn't lie to you.
He could not give himself an out why those latent prints were on two vehicles at two different crime scenes at two different locations.
Mom's over there. I'm gonna talk. I want her to go because things are moving now. Right now.
With Eric not cooperating, Detective Zellner brings in his mother.
His mom eventually arrives at the police department and wants to sit in the interview. It's her right to sit in there with her son. She has no clue. And now she's about to hear for the first time why he's actually there.
Hey, what you got yourself into?
She's just in utter shock. That's the best way to explain it. She gets hysterical. She can't believe it. She's shaken. We decide to go ahead and remove Mom from the interview room and have her watching the CCTV from the mobile gas station. Eric is becoming extremely upset about this. He does not want his mom to see what she's about to see and what he's capable of doing.
Do you recognize anybody in the video?
My son.
Mom immediately identifies her son and lets out a screech. There's no doubt in her mind that she's watching her son commit a murder.
It's horrible. I felt bad for her, actually. I felt very bad for her.
Detective Zellner tries one last time to get Eric to tell the truth.
I continue with the pleading. Moms continue with the pleading. Eventually, Eric breaks down. He reaches over and he actually makes contact and whispers to his mom. He looks at me. I shot him.
You got out of the car. Okay, we ran out of the car. And you got up to the front. You made contact with the driver, correct? Okay. But you made contact with the driver. What happened? I shot him. You shot him? I made contact with him. You know, he wasn't scared at all.
Detective Zellner continues to get all he can from the suspect.
Who was the other shooter, Eric? And don't tell me you don't know. Who was the other shooter? Zena. Dylan's the other shooter.
He ends up telling me the co-defendants' names, Dylan McFarland and Wayne Williams.
Okay, we'll be charged with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated today. Okay? Armed carjacking on top.
At this point, Eric Ellington's placed under arrest for the double murder of both victims and transported to Juvenile Assessment Center, where he's going to be held until he has his hearing. I can't solely base my arrest off of what Eric has relayed to me. I need more concrete evidence to place Wayne Williams and Dylan McFarland at the scene. I got search warrants for their cell phone information, call log, call history, text messages. Dylan McFarland and Wayne Williams' cell phones were actually pinging off the different cell towers as they traveled throughout Miami Gardens and Miami-Dade County.
It showed they happened to be in the exact place at the exact time of all the crimes on the night of the murders and carjackings.
Dylan McFarland and Wayne Williams are arrested.
The mere robbery wasn't enough for them. The mere intimidation of the victims wasn't enough. It led to them taking two innocent lives of two beautiful people for it finally to end their criminal activity and their criminal spree that they were on.
Police develop a theory on what happened after the three young men robbed the Rivases.
They were actually passing that gas station, but they saw a white Mustang in very good condition at the gas pumps, and they wanted that Mustang. They knew they had to have that Mustang. Once they made contact with the victims, Julian just didn't look scared enough, and Eric Ellington decided to shoot him. And my theory is that Eric was actually there to drive the car and take it. And when he looked inside the vehicle, he couldn't drive a stick. So he could not drive a manual vehicle. He didn't know how to operate the clutch. And that's why when he realized it was a manual vehicle, he had to flee back to his only means of escape, which was that green Nissan Pathfinder.
Eric Ellington is found guilty of the murders of Julian Solar and Kenya Duran and receives a life sentence plus 50 years. He receives an additional 50-year sentence for carjacking. Dylan McFarland is sentenced to life on 2 counts of first-degree murder and for the carjacking. Wayne Williams pleads guilty to armed robbery and is sentenced to 17 years in prison.
There's still days that I'll think about this case or something or recall it. I'll drive by the gas station and still won't use that pump. I won't even pull into that lane. I do think about them often, even though it's been almost 11 years now. I still remember that day.
It felt like we had gotten justice for the families. Of course, you never can bring the victims back. And I know they went through a lot, and it messed up their heads and their families and everything was going on. But it was, in my opinion, the best we could do. We got the appropriate verdicts. 3 guilty young men went to prison.
Why they did it, I will never understand. Just that they're pure evil. I always remember her smile, always, and her hugs. She was a great hugger. So I remember that. And I'm telling you, she was very, very infectious. She really was. And very much present in what she would do. The worst travesty of all, that he did not get to spend the rest of his years with his mother because of such a pure love they have between the two of them. That was the greatest loss of all, you know?
I had to turn it around, and instead of thinking he can no longer live out his dreams and he can no longer have the life that he wanted or the family that he wanted, I had to focus on the 23 years that I did have with him. I had to focus on that as being a gift, that I was able to raise him and love him and be proud of the person that he was.
The concept of security is often dictated by geography, isolation, and the unwritten social contracts that bind a community together. In the vast expanse of the South Pacific lies a cluster of islands known as American Samoa, an unincorporated territory of the United States where the rhythms of daily life have long been governed by deep-rooted traditions and an overwhelming sense of communal solidarity. For generations, this remote territory maintained a reputation for tranquility that stood in stark contrast to the turbulent realities of the American mainland. The sheer distance from the continental United States did more than just separate these islands physically. It insulated them from the systemic cycles of violent crime that plague larger metropolitan centers. In this close-knit society, where families are deeply intertwined and the collective memory spans generations, the preservation of peace was not merely a matter of legislative enforcement, but a fundamental cultural imperative. The streets of Pago Pago and the surrounding villages did not echo with the sounds of sirens or the anxiety of urban danger. Instead, they were defined by a profound, almost absolute trust in the shared values of the population, a belief that the community itself possessed the inherent mechanisms necessary to maintain order and resolve conflicts without resorting to extreme measures. This foundational piece was perhaps most visibly reflected in the structural design and operational philosophy of the local law enforcement agency. Prior to the turning point of the year 2010, the legal framework of American Samoa maintained a strict and highly unusual mandate regarding its police force. Local officers were explicitly prohibited by law from carrying firearms during their routine, day-to-day duties. In a modern world where law enforcement had become increasingly militarized, the police officers of this territory patrolled the streets armed with nothing more than traditional batons, handcuffs, and, most importantly, their capacity for verbal negotiation and conflict resolution. This policy was not a consequence of logistical scarcity or institutional neglect. Rather, it was a deliberate, conscious choice that reflected the unique cultural landscape of the islands. The prevailing consensus among both Jing designers of policy and the citizenry was that the introduction of firearms into the daily interactions between police and the public would only serve to introduce unnecessary hostility into an otherwise harmonious environment. The officers were members of the very communities they protected, often related to the individuals they encountered in the line of duty, and the reliance on moral authority and interpersonal respect was deemed far more effective than the threat of lethal force. For decades, this system proved remarkably resilient, reinforcing the widespread perception that American Samoa was a sanctuary fundamentally immune to the severe violent crimes that necessitated an armed police presence elsewhere. At the heart of this policing tradition was a man who embodied the very best qualities of the territory's law enforcement philosophy. Detective Lucilla Brown was a 44-year-old veteran of the department, an individual whose professional life was defined by an unyielding commitment to the safety and well-being of his fellow citizens. With 19 years of dedicated service under his belt, Detective Brown was not merely an officer of the law. He was a foundational pillar of the community, a seasoned investigator who had navigated the complexities of island life with a rare combination of firmness, empathy, and deep cultural understanding. Throughout nearly 2 decades of wearing the uniform, he had managed countless disputes, investigated numerous local incidents, and interacted with thousands of residents, always operating under the long-standing mandate that did not afford him the protection of a firearm. His career was a testament to the belief that an officer's greatest tool was not the weapon at their hip, but the respect they commanded through their character and their dedication to justice. On the morning of July 22, 2010, Detective Brown reported for duty just as he had done for 19 years, unaware that the long-standing assumptions of safety that had protected him and his colleagues for generations were about to be violently dismantled in a matter of seconds. The assignment for Detective Brown on that particular Thursday was to provide security and maintain order at the temporary High Court of American Samoa, which was operating out of the GHC Reed building located in the coastal area of Malaloa, within the capital of Pago Pago. The relocation of judicial proceedings to this temporary venue did not diminish the gravity of the matters handled within its walls, but the atmosphere remained characteristically accessible and community-oriented, lacking the imposing, fortified security measures common in modern judicial complexes on the mainland. There were no advanced electronic screening systems, no heavy metal detectors, and no fortified physical barriers separating the public from the officers of the court. The building was a place where justice was administered in full view of the community, relying on the traditional understanding that the sanctity of the legal process would be respected by all who entered. Detective Brown stood watch in this environment, completely unarmed, relying solely on his presence, his experience, and the collective adherence to the rule of law to ensure that the proceedings carried out inside the GHC Reed building remained peaceful and orderly. The specific focus of the judicial schedule that afternoon centered on a legal matter that carried significant emotional weight for certain segments of the local community. The court had been convening to conclude the trial of an individual named Solomona Samachua, who was facing serious legal jeopardy over allegations involving assault and the illegal possession of weapons. In a small island society, legal disputes of this nature rarely remain confined to the individuals directly named in the indictment. Instead, they often draw the intense interest and active presence of extended family networks who gather to offer support, witness the unfolding of justice, and await the final determination of the court. The atmosphere within the temporary courtroom was thick with anticipation as the proceedings drew to a close and the final verdict was delivered. Ultimately, the court handed down a decision that provided a profound sense of relief to the defendant and his kin. Solomona Samachua was officially acquitted of all charges, cleared of both the assault allegations and the weapons possession infractions that had threatened his freedom. As the formal session adjourned, the tension that had occupied the courtroom began to dissipate, transforming into a collective movement as the spectators, legal professionals, and court personnel prepared to exit the GHC Reed building. The crowd spilled out into the warm afternoon air of Malaloa, a gathering of individuals engaged in quiet conversations, reflections on the trial's outcome, and the routine preparations to return to their daily lives. Among those exiting the building was a man whose presence would soon alter the course of the island's history forever. Siamo Jr., a relative of the newly acquitted Solomona Samachua, was moving through the crowd, carrying with him an underlying purpose that remained entirely hidden from the unsuspecting people around him. While the immediate legal crisis for his family had been resolved by the court's acquittal, Siamo was consumed by an entirely separate, internal motive, a deeply entrenched grievance that had nothing to do with the day's verdict, but everything to do with the unarmed detective who is currently supervising the dispersal of the crowd outside the judicial facility. Detective Lucilla Brown stood near the exit of the temporary court building, performing his final duties for the day by ensuring that the public left the premises in an orderly and secure manner. His 19 years of experience had taught him how to read the moods of crowds, how to maintain a calm and reassuring presence, and how to defuse potential friction through simple observation. He was a familiar face to many of those leaving the building, a man who represented stability and the peaceful resolution of conflict. As he monitored the exiting spectators, he did not perceive any immediate threat, nor could he have anticipated that the very system of policing he had dedicated his life to, one based on the absence of lethal weapons and the reliance on mutual respect, would leave him entirely vulnerable to a calculated act of targeted violence. The vulnerability was absolute, a silent vulnerability dictated by a law that assumed the societal peace would never be fractured by a concealed firearm. It was within this specific window of time, as the crowd continued to filter out into the Malaloa afternoon, that Siamo Jr. deliberately adjusted his path to intercept Detective Brown. The interaction began not with an immediate outburst of rage or an overt display of hostility, but with a calculated, verbal approach designed to lower any potential defensive stance. As he drew closer to the veteran officer, Siamo spoke directly to him, calling out Detective Brown's name to capture his undivided attention in the middle of the bustling crowd. He uttered a specific phrase, a request that on the surface sounded like an appeal for communication. "Give me a chance to talk." These words, delivered in close proximity, suggested a desire to resolve a matter through dialogue, a method entirely consistent with the conversational and community-minded spirit of the island. It was a request that an officer like Detective Brown, who had spent nearly 2 decades utilizing communication as his primary tool, would naturally be inclined to grant, expecting a conversation rather than a confrontation. However, the request for a chance to talk was a deceptive prelude to an act of sudden, unmitigated brutality. Instead of waiting for a response or engaging in a conversation, Siamo Jr. reached into a small bag that he had tightly kept under his armpit, completely concealed from the view of the surrounding public and the court security. From the confines of this bag, he extracted a handgun, a weapon whose very presence on the island represented a severe violation of the established order. Before Detective Brown or any of the nearby eyewitnesses could process the sight of the firearm, Siamo closed the remaining physical distance between them. At an incredibly close range of just a few steps, completely eliminating any possibility for the unarmed detective to defend himself or seek cover, Siamo raised the weapon and fired directly into the body of Detective Lucilla Brown. The sound of the gunfire shattered the peaceful afternoon air of Pago Pago, instantly transforming a routine court adjournment into a scene of absolute horror and confusion. The physical impact of the initial gunfire caused Detective Brown to collapse immediately to the ground, his body incapacitated by the sudden trauma of the assault. The surrounding crowd, including journalists, court attendees, and bystanders, froze in a state of collective shock, unable to immediately comprehend that a police officer had just been shot in broad daylight outside a house of justice. Yet, the horror of the incident was not yet complete. Rather than attempting to flee the scene or acknowledging the gravity of what he had done, Siamo Jr. exhibited a level of cold, systematic cruelty that would deeply traumatize the eyewitnesses. He advanced further toward the fallen officer, deliberately walking until he stood directly over the helpless, prone body of Detective Brown. From this dominant and unyielding position, looking down at the veteran investigator who had served the community for 19 years, Siamo raised the handgun once more and fired 2 additional rounds directly into the body of the helpless victim, ensuring that the assault would be fatal. The execution-style nature of these final shots sent a wave of panic through the immediate area as reporters and citizens scattered in a desperate attempt to find safety from an active shooter. The GHC Reed building, which had stood as a temporary symbol of legal order, was suddenly the backdrop for an unprecedented manifestation of lawlessness. The realization that an officer of the law could be executed so openly, without any means of lethal defense, exposed a profound vulnerability in the infrastructure of the entire territory. For 19 years, Detective Brown had operated under the protective umbrella of a shared cultural contract, a belief that the badge and the uniform carried an inherent authority sufficient to deter extreme violence. In a matter of mere moments, Siamo Jr. had shattered that contract, proving that an unarmed police force was entirely at the mercy of an individual determined to utilize a concealed firearm to settle a grievance. The violence, however, did not cease with the fatal wounding of Detective Brown. As the echo of the additional shots reverberated through Malaloa, the reality of the situation galvanized the other law enforcement officers present at the scene. Recognizing that a catastrophic event was unfolding, Sergeant Lou Fufatu and Detective Bonnie Lemigio, both of whom were also completely unarmed in accordance with the territory's regulations, immediately put their own lives at risk to intervene. Showing immense bravery in the face of an active and deadly threat, the 2 officers rushed forward, attempting to close the distance and physically calm Che, or subdue, the active gunman before he could inflict further casualties upon the fleeing public or the remaining court staff. They moved towards Siamo with no protective gear and no firearms of their own, relying entirely on their training, physical strength, and sheer courage to bring an end to the rampage. Seeing the 2 unarmed officers advancing to intercept him, Siamo Jr. showed no hesitation in extending his campaign of violence to anyone wearing the uniform. He pivoted toward the approaching law enforcement personnel, raised his handgun, and opened fire directly on Sergeant Fufatu and Detective Lemigio. The incoming rounds struck both officers as they attempted to tackle the gunman, inflicting serious injuries that compromised their ability to immediately disarm him. Despite being wounded by the gunfire, the intervention of Fufatu and Lemigio created a critical disruption in Siamo's actions, slowing his movements and preventing him from systematically targeting more victims among the panicked crowd. The sacrifice of these two officers highlighted the immense peril faced by an unarmed police force when confronted by a determined, armed adversary, illustrating a grim reality where courage alone was the only shield against bullets. The chaotic struggle outside the GHC Reed building finally reached its conclusion as additional security personnel, including court-martials and responding police officers, converged on the location. Utilizing the window of opportunity created by the initial intervention of the wounded officers, the assembling law enforcement team swarmed Siamo Jr., utilizing overwhelming physical force to overwhelm him. They managed to successfully tuak, or disarm, the handgun from his grip, terminating the immediate threat of further bloodshed. Siamo was forced to the ground, handcuffed, and formally placed under arrest, bringing an end to a rapid sequence of events that had permanently altered the history of American Samoa. As the suspect was led away in custody, the focus immediately shifted to the casualties left in the wake of his assault, with emergency medical efforts converging on the scene to tend to the wounded officers and confirm the tragic reality of Detective Lucilla Brown's death. The immediate aftermath of the shooting left the community of Pago Pago and the entire territory of American Samoa in a state of profound, unprecedented mourning and psychological shock. The news that a veteran detective had been executed outside a court of law spread rapidly across the islands, challenging the core identity of a society that had long prided itself on its peaceful nature and its unique exemption from the gun violence that characterized the mainland. The realization that 3 officers had been shot, one fatally, while completely unarmed, sparked an immediate, intense public discourse regarding the safety of those tasked with protecting the public. The GHC Reed building, once a routine site of administrative and judicial business, was now a cordoned-off crime scene, marked by the physical remnants of a tragedy that would force a complete reevaluation of the laws, security protocols, and policing philosophies that had governed the territory for over half a century. To understand the profound weight of the tragedy that unfolded outside the temporary High Court of American Samoa on that warm July afternoon, one must first step back from the immediate violence and examine the delicate, intricate social architecture of the islands themselves. American Samoa is a territory defined by its isolation, a cluster of volcanic landmasses rising from the vast expanse of the South Pacific, thousands of miles away from the systemic, fast-paced complexities of the United States mainland. In the year 2010, the territory was home to a modest population fluctuating between 45,000 and 50,000 residents. In a society of this scale, the traditional concepts of urban anonymity simply do not exist. To walk through the streets of Pago Pago or any of the surrounding coastal villages is to move through a living network of shared histories, extended family lineages, and deeply rooted communal obligations. Everyone is connected to someone else. Family trees are preserved in the collective memory of the populace, and an individual's identity is permanently anchored to their ancestral village and their extended family group, known locally as the Aga. This extreme social proximity creates a unique cultural environment where public duty and private life are perpetually intertwined, and where the preservation of peace is not merely a matter of legislative compliance, but a fundamental prerequisite for survival. At the very core of this harmonious coexistence lies the guiding philosophy of Faa Samoa, a term that translates literally to the Samoan way of life. Faa Samoa is the invisible but absolute foundation upon which all social, political, and moral decisions on the islands are built. It is a comprehensive cultural system that prioritizes the welfare of the collective community far above the desires or grievances of the individual. Within this framework, values such as mutual respect, deference to elders, and the maintenance of social equilibrium are fiercely protected. When interpersonal friction inevitably arises, whether stemming from complex disputes over communal land boundaries, historical family rivalries, or localized behavioral infractions, the territory historically relied on a parallel system of traditional governance to resolve the tension before it could escalate into physical confrontation. This system is managed by the Matai, the traditional village chiefs who are carefully chosen by their respective Aga to serve as the custodians of culture, peace, and morality. Through a sophisticated process of dialogue, mediation, and customary ceremonies of reconciliation, The Matai possess a profound moral authority capable of defusing volatile disputes long before they ever reach the threshold of formal criminal law. This traditional mechanism acted as a highly effective societal shock absorber for generations, resulting in a territory where violent crime rates remained exceptionally low and premeditated acts of murder were virtually unheard of in the modern era. Complementing the stabilizing influence of Fa Samoa is the deeply entrenched religious faith that characterizes the daily lives of the island's population. The communities of American Samoa are remarkably devout, with Christian principles heavily woven into the fabric of local governance, educational structures, and social expectations. The village churches serve as central hubs of community life, providing a secondary, highly formalized layer of moral restraint that reinforces the cultural taboos against violence and antisocial behavior. Furthermore, the inescapable reality of island geography functions as a natural deterrent to serious criminal enterprises. On a small island dominated by rugged, impenetrable mountainous interiors and bounded entirely by the vast Pacific Ocean, the concept of a fugitive lifestyle is a physical impossibility. There are no expansive highway systems to facilitate a rapid escape, no sprawling urban metropolises where a face can seamlessly blend into a crowd, and no borders across which a criminal can easily flee from justice. If a significant infraction occurs, the identity of the perpetrator is discovered almost instantaneously by the tightly knit community, and the resulting shame is borne heavily not just by the individual, but by their entire extended family network. This combination of geographic confinement, pervasive religious morality, and the traditional authority of the Matai cultivated a collective consciousness of absolute security among the residents, who lived with the unwavering belief that their islands were a permanent sanctuary fundamentally insulated from the severe, random gun violence that plagued the outside world. It was within this climate of profound societal trust that the legal parameters and operational philosophies of the local law enforcement agency were originally conceived and maintained. Prior to the turning point of 2010, the statutory framework of American Samoa mandated a policy that appeared extraordinary to outside observers, particularly those accustomed to the heavily armed nature of American mainland policing. Routine local police officers were strictly prohibited from carrying firearms in the execution of their daily duties. While police departments across the global landscape were increasingly adopting militarized equipment and lethal weaponry to combat rising tides of urban violence, the territory of American Samoa made a conscious, deliberate choice to maintain an unarmed police force. This policy was not born out of financial austerity or an inability to procure modern equipment. Rather, it was a philosophical statement reflecting the unique cultural identity of the islands. The prevailing consensus among territorial leaders, lawmakers, and the public was that the visible presence of loaded firearms on the hips of police officers would introduce an element of hostility and fear into a society built entirely on mutual respect and familial connection. Because an officer patrolled the very neighborhoods where their own relatives lived, their authority was designed to stem from their personal character, their family reputation, and their ability to communicate effectively, rather than the implicit threat of lethal force. Officers walked their beats armed with nothing more than a standard wooden baton, a pair of handcuffs, and a highly refined capacity for verbal de-escalation. For nearly half a century, this approach proved remarkably successful, reinforcing the widespread conviction that the moral shield of the badge was more than sufficient to protect those who wore it. No single individual embodied the dignity, the efficacy, and the underlying spirit of this unique law enforcement model better than Detective Lucilla Brown. At 44 years of age, Brown was a highly respected veteran investigator who had dedicated 19 years, nearly half of his entire life, to wearing the uniform of the American Samoa Police Department. To examine his extensive career is to understand the modern history of policing on the island. Joining the force as a young man in his mid-20s, Brown had navigated the complexities of territorial law enforcement not through a reliance on physical intimidation, but through a masterful application of cultural diplomacy and interpersonal empathy. He was a familiar and deeply reassuring face across the islands, known universally by his colleagues and the citizenry as a man of exceptional composure, meticulous thoroughness, and absolute fairness. Throughout his nearly 2 decades of service, Detective Brown had been called upon to investigate an immense variety of cases, ranging from delicate family disputes and property damage to localized thefts and physical altercations. In every single instance, he approached his duties with the foundational understanding that the individuals he was investigating were not abstract suspects, but members of the very community he was sworn to protect. He was a foundational pillar of stability within the department, an officer who possessed the rare ability to enter a volatile, emotionally charged situation completely unarmed and restore order simply through the quiet authority of his presence and the steady, reasonable cadence of his voice. Off-duty, his life was completely integrated into the social fabric of Pago Pago. He was a dedicated family man, a reliable neighbor, and a church member whose commitment to the well-being of his fellow citizens extended far beyond the boundaries of his official shift. The daily realities confronting an investigator like Detective Brown during this era were entirely distinct from the sensationalized, high-stakes narratives of mainland criminal justice. Because extreme violence was such an anomaly on the islands, a significant portion of a detective's workload involved structural mediation, working hand-in-hand with village Matai and extended family leaders to ensure that legal infractions were resolved in a manner that satisfied territorial statutes while simultaneously preserving the long-term harmony of the community. This sustained immersion in peaceful conflict resolution naturally reinforced the institutional assumption within the police department that their work, while frequently challenging and emotionally demanding, was safe from the specter of catastrophic violence. This deep-seated assumption was universally shared by the public, creating a collective, systemic blind spot across the territory's infrastructure. The system was designed under the assumption that everyone would continue to play by the unwritten rules of the cultural contract, and it failed to contemplate the possibility that a single, determined individual might completely reject both the traditional morality of Fa Samoa and the formal laws of the territory by introducing a concealed, deadly firearm into a space predicated entirely on peace. This vulnerability was nowhere more apparent than in the physical and operational security protocols of the territorial judicial system. The High Court of American Samoa, while serving as the supreme institution of legal authority and dispute resolution in the territory, did not resemble the heavily fortified, high-security judicial complexes common in modern Western societies. This lack of fortification was even more pronounced when proceedings were forced to relocate to temporary accommodations, such as the GHC Reed building situated in the bustling coastal sector of Malaloa within Pago Pago. The building was an active administrative space, easily accessible to any member of the public walking along the waterfront, and its layout lacked the specialized security infrastructure designed to intercept modern threats. There were no electronic walk-through metal detectors at the entrance, no X-ray screening machines to inspect the bags and belongings of incoming spectators, and no armed sentries stationed at the perimeters to monitor the crowds. The court was viewed as an open, transparent forum belonging to the people, where justice was dispensed in full view of the community and where legal outcomes were decided through structured, peaceful argumentation. The security detachment assigned to these proceedings, which on the afternoon of July 22, 2010, included Detective Lisla Brown, was tasked primarily with managing crowd logistics, providing administrative assistance to court personnel, and ensuring that decorum was maintained as attendees transitioned between the courtroom and the street. The concept that an individual would actively smuggle a loaded handgun into this open, undefended space was entirely outside the horizon of daily expectation for the officers on duty. The profound tragedy of the event lies in the reality that the exact characteristics that made American Samoa a beautiful, peaceful sanctuary, its openness, its rejection of weaponized authority, its reliance on communal trust, were the precise factors that left Detective Brown completely defenseless when his path intersected with an individual harboring an hidden intent for violence. When Siamo Jr. made the calculated decision to bring a concealed firearm to the GHC Reed building that day, he was stepping into an environment that had been completely disarmed by its own history of peace. Detective Brown stood outside that facility, a 44-year-old father, husband, and 19-year veteran of law enforcement, relying entirely on a moral shield of community respect that had successfully brought him home safely at the end of every shift for nearly 2 decades. He wore no protective body armor, carried no service weapon, and had no structural barriers to shield him from a sudden, close-range assault. The stark contrast between the peaceful, trusting history of the territory and the sudden, unmitigated brutality of that afternoon represents a permanent fracture in the narrative of American Samoa. It is the portrait of a community that was forced, in a sequence of moments, to confront the reality that its geographic isolation and cultural traditions could no longer completely protect it from the darkest aspects of human malice, leaving an irreplaceable void where a dedicated public servant had stood for 19 years. The afternoon of July 22, 2010, began its descent into history with the deceptive normalcy that characterizes most moments of catastrophic transition. Outside the temporary High Court of American Samoa, situated within the GHC Reed Building in the coastal Malaloa area of Pago Pago, the atmosphere was defined by the natural rhythm of a judicial adjournment. Inside the structure, the formal mechanisms of the territorial legal system had just concluded a proceeding of significant local interest. The trial of Solomona Samachua, an individual who had been facing serious criminal allegations concerning assault and the illegal possession of weapons, had reached its definitive end. For hours, the courtroom had held the collective anxiety of the defendant's extended family network and the interested public, all waiting to see how the law would adjudicate the charges. When the final determination was read aloud, it brought a profound wave of relief to Samachua's relatives. The court delivered a verdict of full acquittal, officially clearing him of all legal infractions and signaling that he was free to return to his community without the shadow of impending incarceration. As the spectators began to filter out of the GHC Reed Building, the collective tension that had filled the courtroom transformed into a bustling, conversational energy that spilled directly onto the exterior grounds of the facility. This space was entirely open, lacking any of the fortified perimeters or security checkpoints that define contemporary mainland courthouses. It was a gathering point where family members greeted one another, where local journalists positioned themselves to capture the reactions to the high-profile acquittal, and where routine citizens mingled in the warm afternoon air. Moving deliberately through this dispersing crowd was Siamo Siamo Jr., a relative of the newly acquitted Solomona Samachua. On the surface, his presence appeared entirely consistent with the gathering of supportive family members who had assembled to witness the legal victory. However, beneath this veneer of familial solidarity lay an entirely separate, highly destructive intent. Siamo was not focused on the legal victory that had just occurred inside the courtroom, nor was he preparing to celebrate his relative's freedom. Instead, his attention was completely locked onto a single, specific individual who was stationed near the exit of the building, performing the routine duties of public protection. Detective Lucilla Brown stood outside the temporary court building, his presence serving as the primary anchor for order as the large crowd exited into the Malaloa afternoon. With 19 years of dedicated service within the American Samoa Police Department, Detective Brown was the epitome of the territory's traditional approach to law enforcement. He stood at his post completely unarmed, in strict accordance with the territorial laws that prohibited routine officers from carrying firearms. He wore no tactical gear, carried no service weapon on his hip, and possessed no physical barriers to separate himself from the public he was sworn to protect. His security strategy relied entirely on his extensive experience, his personal authority, and the long-standing societal consensus that the uniform of the police department commanded absolute respect. As he monitored the crowd, ensuring that the dispersal remained orderly and peaceful, he had no reason to suspect that the unwritten rules of safety that had protected him for nearly 2 decades were about to be completely violated by an individual carrying a hidden weapon. Siamo Siamo Jr. adjusted his trajectory, navigating through the groups of conversing citizens and media personnel to close the physical distance between himself and the veteran detective. The approach was not marked by a sudden burst of speed or an overt display of aggression that might have triggered an immediate defensive response from the officer or the surrounding security detail. Instead, Siamo utilized a calculated method of verbal engagement designed to lower Detective Brown's guard. Upon reaching the immediate vicinity of the officer, Siamo spoke directly to him, calling out Detective Brown's name to isolate his attention from the broader crowd. He then uttered a specific, deceptive phrase that suggested a desire for peaceful communication. "Give me a chance to talk." This request, delivered in a seemingly measured tone, was perfectly aligned with the community-minded spirit of the islands, where disputes were traditionally handled through dialogue and mutual respect. For a detective who had spent 19 years resolving conflicts through communication rather than force, the verbal request was an invitation to engage in a routine professional interaction. However, the verbal request was nothing more than a chilling prelude to an act of sudden, unmitigated brutality. Before Detective Brown could offer a response or interpret the underlying intent behind the statement, Siamo Jr. acted with catastrophic speed. He reached into a small bag that he had kept tucked, under his armpit throughout the afternoon, a bag that had completely evaded the scrutiny of court security due to the absolute absence of metal detectors or physical searches at the building's entrance. From the hidden confines of this bag, Siamo extracted a handgun, a weapon whose very presence shattered the legal and cultural boundaries of the territory. Before the unarmed detective or any of the nearby eyewitnesses could fully comprehend the sight of the firearm, Siamo eliminated the remaining physical space between them. At a close range of just a few steps, which left Detective Brown with absolutely no opportunity to seek cover, draw a defensive tool, or physically counter the threat, Siamo raised the handgun and fired directly into the body of the veteran officer. The sharp, concussive sound of the initial gunfire tore through the Malaloa afternoon, instantly silencing the ambient noise of the crowd and replacing it with a collective paralysis of absolute shock. The physical impact of the bullet caused Detective Lisla Brown to collapse instantly to the ground, his body completely incapacitated by the sudden, severe trauma of the assault. For a fraction of a second, the surrounding public, including the journalists who were holding cameras and the citizens who had just been celebrating the court's verdict, froze in a state of profound disbelief. In a society where police officers did not carry weapons and where gun violence was an extreme anomaly, the visual reality of a decorated detective being shot down outside a house of justice was too foreign to be processed immediately. The immediate area became a theater of frozen horror, as the absolute vulnerability of the territory's unarmed law enforcement framework was exposed in the most violent manner imaginable. Yet, the true depth of the tragedy was realized in the moments that immediately followed the initial collapse of the officer. Rather than attempting to exploit the confusion to escape from the scene, or exhibiting any sign of hesitation regarding the gravity of his actions, Siamo Jr. demonstrated a level of cold, systematic cruelty that would permanently scar the memory of everyone present. He did not run. Instead, he took deliberate steps forward, advancing until he stood directly over the helpless, prone body of Detective Brown as he lay on the pavement. From this position of absolute, uncontested dominance, looking down at the 19-year veteran who had dedicated his life to preserving the peace of the islands, Siamo raised the handgun once more. With calculated finality, he fired 2 additional rounds directly into the body of the fallen detective, ensuring with absolute certainty that the wounds inflicted would be fatal. These final execution-style shots shattered any remaining hope of survival, transforming the incident from an aggravated assault into a definitive, premeditated assassination. The sound of the secondary volleys broke the collective paralysis of the crowd, unleashing a wave of absolute panic across the exterior of the GHC Reed building. The journalists dropped their professional focus, fleeing alongside terrified citizens who scattered in every direction to find cover from what had suddenly become an active shooter situation. The open, unfortified nature of the judicial grounds, which had always been celebrated as a symbol of community access, now offered no protection to the fleeing public. The pavement where Detective Brown lay was transformed into the epicenter of an unprecedented security crisis, as the realization gripped the crowd that an armed individual was loose, completely unhindered by the traditional moral taboos or the legal statutes of the territory. The absolute chaos of the scene threatened to expand exponentially as the gunman remained standing, weapon in hand, completely controlling the immediate space through the threat of lethal force. It was at this critical juncture, as the crowd fled and the reality of the execution settled over the scene, that the inherent bravery of the territory's law enforcement personnel manifested in its most profound form. Stationed in the immediate vicinity were Sergeant Lou Fufatu and Detective Bonnie Lemigio. Both of these officers were operating under the exact same legal mandates that had left Detective Brown defenseless. They were completely unarmed, carrying no service weapons or protective equipment capable of countering a firearm. They had just witnessed their colleague, a 19-year veteran of their department, cut down and executed at close range by an active gunman who still held a loaded handgun. In a modern mainland context, standard tactical protocol would dictate seeking cover and awaiting the arrival of specialized armed units. However, in the immediate reality of Malaloa, there were no armed units readily available to deploy, and every second that passed increased the risk of further casualties among the panicked public. Faced with an extraordinary and deadly crisis, Sergeant Fufatu and Detective Lemigio made a conscious, immediate decision to place their own lives between the active gunman and the fleeing crowd. Showing immense courage that transcended the boundaries of routine duty, the two unarmed officers rushed forward simultaneously, charging directly towards Siamo Siamo Jr. with the sole objective of physically calming Che, or subduing him before he could target additional victims. They moved across the open pavement with no ballistic vests, no firearms to return fire, and no tactical shields, relying entirely on their physical strength, their training in hand-to-hand de-escalation, and their sheer determination to bring an end to the violence. Their advance was a direct challenge to the armed lawlessness that had temporarily seized control of the judicial grounds, representing a desperate, heroic attempt to re-establish order through physical sacrifice. Seeing the two unarmed law enforcement officers advancing rapidly to intercept him, Siamo Siamo Jr. showed no hesitation in turning his weapon upon anyone wearing the uniform of the department. He pivoted away from the fallen body of Detective Brown, raised the handgun, and opened fire directly into the path of the charging officers. The incoming rounds struck both Sergeant Fufatu and Detective Lemigio as they attempted to close the final distance to tackle him, inflicting serious wounds that caused severe physical trauma to their bodies. The impact of the gunfire compromised their physical mobility, preventing them from immediately completing the takedown and disarming the suspect, as they had intended. The sight of two more officers being shot down in rapid succession underscored the terrifying reality of the situation. The territory's police force was facing a threat that their traditional methods and lack of equipment had never prepared them to combat, leaving them to fight bullets with nothing but their own flesh and blood. Despite the fact that both Sergeant Fufatu and Detective Lemigio were wounded in the assault, their heroic intervention proved to be the decisive turning point in the mechanics of the incident. By forcing Siamo to turn his attention away from the general public and expend his ammunition and focus on them, the two officers created a critical disruption in the gunman's actions. Their willingness to charge the weapon effectively halted any potential systematic rampage through the fleeing crowd, slowing Siamo's movements and buying precious seconds for the remaining security apparatus of the court to mobilize. The sacrifice of Fufatu and Lemigio demonstrated that while their lack of firearms left them at a severe disadvantage, their commitment to the safety of the community remained absolute, providing a human shield that protected countless lives at the cost of their own well-being. As the confrontation with the wounded officers stalled Siamo's momentum, the window of opportunity they created allowed additional security forces to converge on the location. Responding court-martials, alongside other police personnel who had been alerted by the initial echoes of gunfire, rushed onto the pavement of the GHC Reed building. Utilizing overwhelming physical numbers, the assembling law enforcement team swarmed Siamo Siamo Jr. before he could reload, re-aim, or inflict any further injuries. A violent, chaotic struggle ensued on the ground as the officers worked desperately to tuak, or disarm, the handgun from the suspect's grip. Through sheer physical force and collective determination, the weapon was finally pried from Siamo's hands, completely neutralizing the immediate lethal threat. The suspect was pinned to the concrete, his hands secured behind his back in handcuffs, formally terminating a rapid, bloody sequence of events that had permanently shattered the historical peace of American Samoa. With the gunman officially secured in custody and led away from the immediate area, the scene transitioned into a frantic, emotionally devastating medical emergency. The exterior of the temporary High Court was now a landscape of severe trauma, with 3 decorated law enforcement officers lying wounded on the pavement. Emergency medical personnel and responding officers swarmed the site, directing their immediate efforts toward treating the injuries sustained by Sergeant Fufatu and Detective Lemigio, while simultaneously attempting to administer aid to Detective Lucilla Brown. However, the systematic nature of the injuries inflicted during the execution-style shooting left no room for medical intervention. It was quickly confirmed at the scene that Detective Brown, a 44-year-old father, husband, and 19-year veteran of the force, had succumbed to his wounds. The area was rapidly cordoned off, transforming the once peaceful public gathering space into a highly secured federal crime scene, marked by the physical evidence of a tragedy that would force the entire territory to confront a dark, unprecedented chapter in its legal and social history. The transition from an active, chaotic crisis to a formal criminal investigation is often marked by a heavy, sudden silence that descends over a crime scene once the immediate threats have been neutralized. In the Malaloa sector of Pago Pago, as Siamo Siamo Jr. was secured in handcuffs and led away from the exterior of the GHC Reed building, the responding law enforcement personnel were forced to immediately suppress their profound personal grief to establish a highly methodical investigative perimeter. The reality confronting the department was unprecedented and deeply disturbing. They were tasked with processing a homicide scene where the victim was one of their own most respected veteran investigators, and where 2 additional colleagues lay wounded by gunfire. The open pavement, which only minutes prior had been filled with the conversational energy of a routine court adjournment, was quickly cordoned off with security tape, transforming a public administrative space into a strictly controlled repository of physical evidence. Local investigators, working alongside territorial authorities, faced the daunting task of piecing together a comprehensive, step-by-step reconstruction of an event that had unfolded in broad daylight before dozens of eyewitnesses, ensuring that every piece of data was meticulously documented for the legal proceedings that would inevitably follow. The first critical phase of the investigation centered entirely on the systematic collection and preservation of physical evidence scattered across the pavement outside the temporary High Court facility. Investigators began by mapping the exact spatial layout of the scene, documenting the precise locations where Detective Lucilla Brown had fallen and where the subsequent struggle with Sergeant Lou Fufatu and Detective Bonnie Lemigio had taken place. The primary focus of this physical recovery was the weapon utilized in the assault, the handgun that Siamo Siamo Jr. had successfully introduced into the unsecured environment of the court grounds. Forensic specialists carefully secured the firearm, noting its mechanical state, its remaining ammunition capacity, and its positioning relative to the victim. Alongside the weapon itself, investigators recovered the small bag that Siamo had kept tucked under his armpit, which had served as the instrument of concealment that allowed him to bypass the routine observations of court security. On the concrete floor, the recovery of spent ballistic casings provided an undeniable physical timeline of the shooting, marking the initial discharge that incapacitated Detective Brown and the subsequent execution-style rounds that were fired as the suspect stood directly over the prone officer, as well as the volleys directed at the intervening personnel. Simultaneously, a massive effort was launched to isolate and interview the numerous eyewitnesses who had been present on the grounds when the violence erupted. Because the shooting occurred immediately following a high-profile court adjournment, the pool of potential witnesses was exceptionally large, comprising court administrative staff, exiting spectators, and local journalists who had been positioned to cover the conclusion of the trial. Investigators worked systematically to record individual accounts, seeking to establish a definitive timeline of the suspect's movements prior to the first shot. These interviews quickly yielded a remarkably consistent narrative regarding the calculated manner of Siamo's approach. Multiple witnesses detailed how the suspect had moved through the crowd with an unsettling deliberation, bypassing other citizens to directly target Detective Brown. Crucially, the witness statements provided investigators with the exact verbal exchange that preceded the violence, confirming that Siamo had explicitly called out the detective's name and uttered the deceptive phrase requesting a chance to talk, a detail that proved the interaction was intentionally initiated by the suspect to close the physical distance between them. A vital component of this witness documentation process involved gathering the statements of the two surviving law enforcement officers, Sergeant Lou Fufatu and Detective Bonnie Lemigio, whose immediate accounts were invaluable despite the severe physical trauma they had endured. From their medical treatment environments, the wounded officers were able to provide investigators with a precise description of the transition from the initial shooting of Detective Brown to the expansion of the active shooter event. They recounted the exact mechanics of their intervention, detailing how they had recognized the immediate mortal peril facing their colleague and the surrounding public, and how they had advanced entirely unarmed to neutralize the threat. Their statements verified that Siamo had shown no hesitation in redirecting his lethal force toward anyone attempting to uphold the law, firing directly at them as they attempted to complete the physical takedown. The documentation of their experiences not only underscored the immense heroism displayed on the pavement that afternoon, but also cemented the legal basis for the additional charges of first-degree assault that the suspect would eventually face. With the physical evidence secured and the witness statements compiled into a structured framework, the investigation encountered its primary analytical turning point, shifting from the question of what had occurred to the far more complex question of why. In the immediate hours following the tragedy, the most logical and prevalent hypothesis among both the police department and the general public centered on the judicial proceedings that had concluded just moments before the shooting. The court had just delivered a verdict of full acquittal for Solomona Samachua, a relative of Siamo Jr., regarding charges of assault and weapons possession. To any outside observer, the timeline suggested a direct, explosive correlation. It appeared highly probable that the shooting was a chaotic, emotionally volatile reaction linked directly to the high-stakes environment of the courtroom or an act of aggressive retaliation stemming from the trial's underlying dynamics. Investigators initially structured their inquiries around this assumption, preparing to evaluate whether the assassination was an impulsive manifestation of familial defense or courtroom fallout that had spontaneously escalated into public bloodshed. However, as the formal interrogation of Siamo Jr. commenced within the controlled confines of the police department's investigative facilities, this initial hypothesis was completely and systematically dismantled. Facing structured questioning from experienced interrogators, the suspect did not attempt to obfuscate his role in the physical execution of Detective Brown, given the overwhelming nature of his immediate apprehension at the scene of the crime. Yet, when investigators pressed for the underlying catalyst behind his decision to bring a loaded handgun to the temporary high court and open fire, Siamo delivered a revelation that completely redirected the entire trajectory of the case file. He explicitly stated to the interrogation team that his violent actions were not a sudden, reactive response to the courtroom trial of his relative, Solomona Samachua, nor were they triggered by the specific legal outcomes delivered inside the GHC Reed building that afternoon. Instead, Siamo admitted that his decision to assassinate Detective Lucilla Brown was rooted entirely in a deep-seated, pre-existing personal grievance. This critical admission introduced a profound turning point into the official record, transforming the legal and psychological understanding of the crime. Siamo utilized the specific English terminology of something personal to describe the underlying motive that had driven him to execute the veteran investigator. According to the data gathered during the interrogation and documented within the formal court records, this personal conflict was not a recent flashpoint but a toxic, unresolved friction that had been steadily accumulating between the two men over an extended historical period prior to July 22, 2010. The suspect's confession revealed that the true nature of the crime was far more calculated and insidious than a spontaneous burst of courtroom rage. It was a targeted, deliberate act of retribution that had been nurtured in the shadow of their private interactions, completely separate from the public duties Detective Brown was performing on behalf of the territorial judicial system. The documentation of this personal motive completely altered the strategy of the prosecution and the structural composition of the investigative file. By establishing that the murder was driven by a long-standing personal grievance rather than an impulsive reaction to a courtroom verdict, the investigative findings definitively proved the element of premeditation. The data demonstrated that Siamo Siamo Jr. had not merely lost control of his emotions upon exiting the trial. Rather, he had consciously chosen to arm himself with a concealed handgun, transport that weapon to a public administrative building where he knew Detective Brown would be stationed, and exploit the structural vulnerability of an unarmed police presence to systematically execute his target. The GHC Reed building was not the catalyst for his anger, but merely the tactical venue he selected to carry out a pre-planned act of personal vengeance. As the active phase of the investigation drew to a close, the compilation of the final report painted a chilling portrait of a crime that was both deeply personal and fundamentally systemic in its implications. Investigators had successfully recovered the physical instruments of the crime, verified the sequence of events through an unassailable matrix of eyewitness testimonies, and secured a direct confession regarding the underlying personal animosity that fueled the suspect's actions. The investigative file was transitioned to the judicial authorities as a watertight case, leaving no doubt as to the identity of the shooter or the premeditated nature of his intent. Yet, the revelation that a 19-year veteran of law enforcement had been systematically hunted and executed due to a private grievance in a public, undefended space left the department and the entire community of American Samoa to grapple with a deeply unsettling reality. The traditional protections of societal respect and cultural isolation had failed completely to insulate them from a deeply personal manifestation of calculated malice. The transfer of the criminal case against Siamo Siamo Jr. from the immediate custody of the police department into the formal arena of the territorial and federal judicial systems marked the beginning of an extraordinary, prolonged legal saga that would test the very boundaries of American Samoa's statutory infrastructure. In the wake of the catastrophic shooting outside the GHC Reed building, the traditional serenity of the islands was replaced by an intense, highly formalized effort to adjudicate an offense that had no modern parallel in the territory's history. The gravity of the situation was compounded by the unique political status of American Samoa as an unincorporated territory of the United States, a status that creates a complex interplay between local territorial laws and federal legal authorities. Because the victim of the premeditated assassination was a decorated law enforcement officer who was actively engaged in the execution of his public duties at a judicial facility, the ramifications of the crime instantly attracted the direct intervention of high-level legal strategists. The local prosecutors, recognizing the unprecedented nature of the assault on the framework of territorial law enforcement, worked in close coordination with federal authorities to construct an indictment that reflected the absolute severity of the violence inflicted upon Detective Lucilla Brown, Sergeant Lou Fufatu, and Detective Bonnie Lemigio. This collaborative legal assessment quickly culminated in a historic and highly controversial decision that would reverberate across the entire legal landscape of the South Pacific. Due to the shocking, execution-style characteristics of a homicide and the direct targeting of an unarmed police officer, the prosecution authorities officially announced their intention to pursue the absolute maximum penalty available under the overarching framework of the law. They proposed the implementation of the death penalty for Siamo Siamo Jr. This strategic decision instantly elevated the case from a standard territorial murder prosecution into a monumental constitutional milestone, as it marked the first time in more than 50 years that the government of American Samoa had actively considered or sought the application of capital punishment. The announcement sent shockwaves through the local populace and the legal community alike, forcing an immediate, intense reevaluation of the territory's ethical, cultural, and structural relationship with state-sanctioned execution, a concept that had long been dormant within the collective consciousness of the islands. The introduction of a potential capital sentence immediately exposed a profound, systemic vacuum within the physical and administrative architecture of the American Samoa justice system. To analyze the reality of capital punishment within the territory was to confront a total absence of the modern infrastructure required to carry out such a sentence. The historical records revealed that the absolute final instance of a state-sanctioned execution in American Samoa had occurred all the way back in the year 1939, an era completely removed from the constitutional standards and human rights frameworks of the 21st century. In that distant pre-war historical context, the execution had been carried out through the rudimentary and archaic mechanism of hanging, a method that was completely obsolete and legally indefensible under modern jurisprudence. In the decades that followed that 1939 event, the territory had completely dismantled its capacity to execute prisoners, evolving into a society that relied exclusively on incarceration for its most severe offenses. Consequently, as the legal teams began to process the capital request against Sialmo, they were forced to acknowledge that the territory possessed absolutely no functional facilities, no specialized execution chambers, and no approved medical or mechanical apparatus necessary to conduct a contemporary execution. Furthermore, the territory lacked any established, legally vetted administrative protocols or operational guidelines required to govern the incredibly complex process of a modern execution, which must withstand intense federal constitutional scrutiny regarding the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. The government was faced with the absurd and terrifying prospect of having to construct an entire capital punishment apparatus from scratch, an undertaking that would require millions of dollars in infrastructural investments, extensive specialized training for correctional personnel, and the creation of an entirely new regulatory framework in a society that was culturally and spiritually opposed to the mechanics of institutional killing. This glaring deficit in infrastructure and legal protocol quickly transformed the case into a site of intense political and constitutional friction, centering heavily on the executive leadership of the territory. Governor Togiola Telefono, who served as the chief executive of American Samoa during this critical period, emerged as a powerful, uncompromising voice of opposition against the prosecution's capital ambitions. Governor Telefono's resistance was anchored not only in his deep personal and moral convictions regarding the sanctity of human life, but also in a pragmatic, clear-eyed assessment of the immense legal and systemic chaos that a capital prosecution would inflict upon his territory. He recognized that the attempt to pursue the death penalty in a jurisdiction completely devoid of the necessary legal infrastructure and historical precedent would trigger an endless cycle of constitutional challenges, federal injunctions, and administrative gridlock that would paralyze the territorial court system for years. Actively leveraging the full authority of his executive office, Governor Telefono initiated a sustained, highly strategic campaign to pressure the prosecution team to withdraw their capital demands. Throughout 2011 and into the early months of 2012, the governor consistently highlighted the insurmountable constitutional barriers, the complete absence of physical infrastructure, and the profound violation of traditional Samoan values that the death penalty represented. He argued forcefully that the pursuit of an execution was not only logistically impossible for the territory to manage, but was also entirely unnecessary to achieve absolute justice for the family of Detective Brown and the wounded officers. The persistent, calculated pressure from the executive branch ultimately achieved its intended effect. In the year 2012, the prosecution formally relented, officially withdrawing the proposal for the death penalty and removing the specter of capital litigation from the case file, thereby reverting the maximum potential penalty to life imprisonment. The removal of the death penalty, however, did not signal a rapid resolution to the criminal proceedings, as the case against Sialmo Jr. entered a phase of protracted procedural stagnation that would drag on for several more years. The judicial machinery of the territory moved with an agonizing slowness, frustrated by a continuous series of structural delays that tested the patience and emotional resilience of the victim's family, the surviving officers, and the public. A primary driver of this extensive gridlock was the frequent, systematic turnover of defense counsel assigned to represent the suspect. Because of the immense severity of the charges, the high-volume nature of the evidentiary files, and the unique complexities of territorial law, multiple defense attorneys found themselves unable or unwilling to maintain long-term representation of Sialmo, resulting in a continuous cycle of withdrawals and new appointments. Each time a new legal team assumed control of the defense, the court was forced to grant substantial continuances to allow the incoming lawyers to review thousands of pages of investigative data, cross-examine physical evidence, and reformulate their defensive strategies, ensuring that the trial date remained perpetually over the horizon. This multi-year period of legal limbo was characterized by complex, behind-the-scenes litigation concerning evidentiary admissibility, the psychological evaluation of the suspect, and the precise statutory framing of the charges. The defense worked extensively to challenge various components of the prosecution's case file, attempting to find procedural vulnerabilities that might mitigate the severity of the impending trial. Meanwhile, the prosecution remained unyielding, supported by the airtight matrix of physical evidence, ballistic reports, and overwhelming eyewitness testimonies that had been meticulously compiled during the initial investigative phase. This structural stalemate persisted across the mid-2010s, transforming the case into one of the longest and most exhaustively litigated homicide files in the modern history of the Pago Pago judiciary, a testament to the immense friction that occurs when an extraordinary, catastrophic crime collides with a traditional legal system unaccustomed to processing high-stakes, multi-victim gun violence. The definitive breakthrough in this exhausting legal stalemate finally arrived in March of 2016, nearly 6 full years after the fatal shots were fired on the pavement of Malaloa. Recognizing the absolute futility of facing a full criminal trial against an unassailable mountain of evidence and eyewitness accounts, Siamo Jr. and his remaining legal defense team entered into formal negotiations with the government to secure a definitive plea agreement. The resulting compromise served as the ultimate mechanism to permanently conclude the litigation without risking the unpredictable dynamics of a prolonged jury trial. Under the strict terms of the negotiated settlement, Siamo agreed to formally waive his right to a trial and enter a binding admission of criminal guilt. In exchange, the government formalized the precise statutory parameters of his conviction, ensuring that he would face a definitive, non-negotiable sentence that would guarantee his permanent removal from society while avoiding any future attempts to revive capital litigation. During the historic court session in March 2016, Siamo Jr. stood before the judicial authorities and officially entered his pleas of guilty to the core components of the indictment. He pleaded guilty to the charge of ko wai jayat nuoi kapdu 2, or intentional murder in the second degree, explicitly acknowledging his criminal responsibility for the calculated, fatal execution of Detective Lucilla Brown. Simultaneously, he entered separate guilty pleas to 2 distinct counts of Han Hung Kapdu 1, or assault in the first degree, formally admitting to the intentional, violent wounding of Sergeant Lou Fufatu and Detective Bonnie Lemigio during their heroic attempt to disarm him at the scene of the crime. The formal recording of these pleas represented the absolute, undeniable confirmation of his sole guilt, bringing a long-awaited measure of legal finality to the physical acts of violence that had shattered the territory 6 years prior. The final judicial resolution of the tragedy was reached in April of 2016, when the court convened for the formal sentencing phase of the proceedings. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with the collective memory of the 19-year veteran detective who had been lost, and the lasting physical and psychological scars borne by the 2 surviving officers. The presiding judge, operating under the full authority of territorial statutes and reinforced by the terms of the plea agreement, delivered a sentence designed to reflect the absolute intolerance of the law toward premeditated violence against those who protect the public. The court sentenced Siamo Jr. to serve multiple, consecutive life sentences without the possibility of reduction or early release. By mandating that the life sentences for the murder of Detective Brown and the severe assaults on Sergeant Fufatu and Detective Lemigio be served consecutively rather than concurrently, the judiciary ensured with absolute mathematical and legal certainty that the perpetrator would remain confined within the federal prison system for the entirety of his natural life, guaranteeing that he would never again step foot upon the islands he had so violently transformed. The resolution of the legal proceedings against Siamo Jr. in the spring of 2016 provided a formal closure to the paperwork of crime, but the true aftermath of a tragedy is rarely confined to the signing of a plea agreement or the delivery of consecutive life sentences. For the territory of American Samoa, the date of July 22, 2010, remained an open, profound wound that defied the passage of time, leaving a permanent scar across the collective consciousness of the islands. The loss of Detective Lucilla Brown was not merely a statistic in a crime ledger, it was an irreplaceable void felt across every village, every family network, and within the very soul of the law enforcement community he had served so faithfully for nearly 2 decades. The islands had lost a father, a husband, a cultural diplomat, and a foundational pillar of stability, and the realization that his life had been cut down in broad daylight outside a house of justice forced the entire society into a period of deep, painful introspection. The long-standing illusion that their geographic isolation and deep adherence to the principles of FA Samoa could permanently insulate them from the darkest manifestations of calculated human malice had been violently and irrevocably shattered on the pavement of Malaloa. This profound loss served as the ultimate catalyst for an existential crisis within the infrastructure of the American Samoa Police Department and the territorial government itself. For generations, the policy of maintaining an unarmed police force had been celebrated as a shining testament to the peaceful nature of the territory and a reflection of a society built on mutual respect rather than the threat of weaponized authority. Officers had walked their beats armed only with the moral weight of their badges, their family reputations, and their capacity for verbal de-escalation, operating under the institutional assumption that the community would always respect the unwritten social contract that protected those who wore the uniform. However, the assassination of Detective Brown and the subsequent wounding of Sergeant Lou Fufatu and Detective Bonnie Lemigio provided a grim, undeniable demonstration that a moral shield was entirely useless against a determined individual with a concealed firearm. The tragedy exposed a terrifying operational reality. The very laws designed to preserve the peaceful identity of the islands had left their protectors completely defenseless, forcing brave public servants to counter lethal ballistic threats with nothing more than their bare hands and sheer courage. Consequently, the case file of Detective Brown became the most significant piece of evidence utilized by territorial leaders and law enforcement administrators to demand a fundamental overhaul of the policing philosophy that had governed the territory for over half a century. The traditional mindset that viewed firearms as an unnecessary instrument of hostility was forced to yield to the cold, pragmatic necessity of officer survival. A profound transformation swept through the administrative corridors of Pago Pago as the government officially initiated the complex, highly sensitive process of changing the legal and operational framework of the police department. This historic shift marked the official commencement of a comprehensive program designed to train, license, and systematically equip local police officers with service firearms for the very first time in modern territorial history. This was not a decision embraced with celebration, but rather one accepted with a heavy sense of inevitability, a recognition that the security landscape of the islands had changed forever, and that the preservation of an officer's life required the adoption of the very tools they had resisted for decades. The implementation of this new armed policing model required an extensive restructuring of the department's training infrastructure and regulatory standards. Law enforcement officials had to design rigorous qualification courses, establish strict guidelines governing the use of force, and ensure that every officer underwent comprehensive psychological assessments and tactical training before being granted the legal authority to carry a weapon in public. The logistical transition was accompanied by a deep psychological adjustment for the officers themselves, who had spent their entire careers relying on communication and community diplomacy to resolve conflicts. Now, they were forced to adapt to the physical and moral responsibility of carrying a lethal weapon on their hips, a daily reminder of the permanent fracture that had occurred on July 22, 2010. The introduction of firearms into routine patrols fundamentally altered the visual and symbolic relationship between the police and the public, transforming the officer from a purely communal mediator into a traditional, armed representative of state power, a shift that highlighted the profound loss of societal innocence that the tragedy had brought upon the islands. Parallel to the transformation of the police force was a radical, permanent reconfiguration of the physical architecture of public and judicial spaces across American Samoa. Prior to the shooting, the island's government offices, administrative complexes, and court facilities were characterized by their openness and accessibility, reflecting a cultural belief that the institutions of leadership and justice belonged unrestrictedly to the people. The concepts of fortified entryways, electronic screening checkpoints, and armed security perimeters were viewed by the local population as entirely unnecessary imports from the mainland, foreign measures that had no place in a society where everyone was connected through lineage and mutual trust. The GHC Reed building had stood as a symbol of this accessibility, an open facility where citizens could freely walk to witness the legal process without encountering physical barriers or institutional suspicion. The violent events of that July afternoon instantly rendered that open philosophy obsolete, triggering a comprehensive fortification of the territory's infrastructure. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, the government enacted strict new security regulations that required a complete re-engineering of every public facility in American Samoa. All government buildings, executive offices, and judicial structures were systematically fitted with advanced walk-through electronic metal detectors and baggage screening systems, permanently altering the experience of entering a house of law or public administration. Robust physical barriers and restricted access security checkpoints were established to control the flow of pedestrian traffic and ensure that no individual could approach an administrative space with a concealed weapon. The very measures that the population had previously dismissed as paranoid or redundant became standard, non-negotiable fixtures of daily life. The open pavement where citizens once gathered to converse was now carved up by security fences and patrolled by vigilant personnel, a visible testament to the reality that the physical landscape of the islands had been permanently altered to guard against a recurring threat. This structural fortification represented far more than a logistical upgrade. It symbolized a profound psychological shift for the citizenry of American Samoa, who had to learn to navigate a world where institutional trust had been replaced by systematic screening. The introduction of metal detectors and security barriers introduced a layer of alienation into the interactions between the government and the community, a daily reminder of the specific act of violence that had necessitated their installation. Every time a resident stepped through a metal detector at the High Court or paused at a security checkpoint outside an administrative building, they were forced to confront the legacy of Detective Lucilla Brown. The physical barriers served as a permanent monument to a tragedy that had severed the historical connection between public accessibility and public safety, proving that the price of protecting those who administered justice was the loss of the complete openness that had once defined the island's communal spaces. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of the tragedy outside the temporary High Court lies in the delicate balance American Samoa must now maintain between preserving its cultural identity and adapting to the harsh security realities of the modern world. The territory did not completely abandon the principles of FA Samoa, nor did it allow the introduction of firearms and security checkpoints to totally destroy the spirit of community and familial connection that defines life in the South Pacific. The village Matai still mediate local disputes, the extended AGA networks still provide a foundation of moral and emotional support, and the deep religious faith of the people continues to offer a framework for healing and reconciliation. Yet, the unwritten social contract that once stood as the sole guarantor of public safety has been permanently supplemented by the tangible infrastructure of modern law enforcement. The islands have evolved, moving forward with an armed police force and fortified public buildings, carrying the memory of a decorated 19-year veteran whose sacrifice became the foundation upon which the security of the entire territory was rebuilt. As the warm Pacific breeze continues to blow across the coastal waters of Malaloa and the routine business of the High Court proceeds within its newly secured facilities, the silence that surrounds the memory of July 22, 2010, is filled with a deep, permanent reverence. Detective Lucilla Brown's name is etched into the history of American Samoa not merely as a victim of a cruel, premeditated act of personal vengeance, but as a transformative figure whose tragic death forced a society to look into the mirror and make the agonizing choices necessary to protect its own. The scars on the pavement have long since faded, and the physical wounds sustained by Sergeant Fufatu and Detective Lemigio have healed into lasting reminders of an extraordinary act of unarmed heroism. But the structural and philosophical changes that arose from that single afternoon remain fully intact, a permanent, unbreakable perimeter of defense designed to ensure that no other family, no other department, and no other community on these islands will ever have to face the absolute vulnerability that claimed the life of a dedicated protector who stood for peace until his final breath. The story of Detective Lucilla Brown and the transformation of American Samoa does not conclude with the hardening of buildings or the arming of officers, but rather with the quiet, persistent pulse of a community learning to live within a new reality. In the years following the 2016 sentencing, the GHC Reed building transitioned back to its original purposes, yet the atmosphere of Malaloa remains fundamentally altered, carrying the invisible weight of that July afternoon in every sea breeze that sweeps across the harbor. To walk through Pago Pago today is to witness a society that has successfully integrated the necessary mechanisms of modern security without surrendering the essential warmth of the Samoan spirit. The metal detectors and the armed patrols have become part of the landscape, no longer viewed as intrusive anomalies, but as the silent guardians of a peace that was once taken for granted. This shift represents the ultimate resilience of the territory, the ability to recognize a profound vulnerability, to mourn a devastating loss, and to build a more robust future while still holding onto the cultural values that make the islands a sanctuary. For the family of Detective Brown, the passage of time has not diminished the stature of the man who stood as a pillar of their lives for 44 years. His legacy is preserved not just in the official archives of the police department or the structural changes to the High Court, but in the continued service and integrity of those he inspired. The younger generation of officers now entering the force in American Samoa undergoes a training regimen that Lucilla Brown could never have imagined, learning the technicalities of firearms and tactical defense alongside the traditional arts of community mediation. They carry the tools of lethal force with a somber understanding of why they are necessary, taught through the history of a veteran who served for 19 years without them. This new era of policing is perhaps the most significant monument to his sacrifice, a department that is better prepared, more vigilant, and more capable of protecting its own, ensuring that no other officer is forced to face a deadly threat with an empty holster. The two survivors of the assault, Sergeant Lou Fufatu and Detective Bonnie Lemigio, carry their own unique legacies as living symbols of the heroism that manifested in the face of absolute lawlessness. Their recovery was not merely a physical process, but a symbolic one for the entire department, proving that even in the moment of greatest vulnerability, the commitment to the unwritten social contract remained unbroken. Their decision to charge an active gunman while unarmed remains one of the most extraordinary acts of bravery in the history of the South Pacific, a reminder that the true strength of a police force lies not in the equipment it carries, but in the character of the individuals who wear the uniform. They continue to represent the bridge between the old world of absolute communal trust and the new world of professionalized security, embodying the transition of a territory that refused to be defeated by a single act of malice. As American Samoa looks toward the future, the lessons of 2010 serve as a guiding light for other isolated communities facing the complexities of modern crime and the erosion of traditional safety. The islands have demonstrated that it is possible to modernize a security infrastructure without losing the soul of a culture. The FAA Samoa remains the heartbeat of the territory, providing the moral and social cohesion that no metal detector or firearm could ever replace. The tragedy of Lucilla Brown was a catalyst for change, but the response to that tragedy was a reaffirmation of the community's strength. The territory chose to protect itself, to honor its fallen, and to continue moving forward with a balanced perspective that acknowledges the reality of danger while never ceasing to strive for harmony. The quietude that now settles over the High Court at the end of each day is a different kind of silence than the one that existed before 2010. It is a silence born of vigilance and a deep, earned respect for the fragility of peace. The memory of the detective who called out for a chance to talk remains a sacred part of the island's narrative, a story of a life dedicated to the service of others and a sacrifice that redefined the meaning of protection. American Samoa stands as a testament to the idea that even the most peaceful sanctuary must sometimes fortify its gates, but the beauty of the islands remains in the fact that those gates are still held open by a people who believe in the power of community, the necessity of justice, and the enduring legacy of those who gave everything to keep them safe. The echoes of a tragedy of this magnitude do not merely fade into the historical record, they embed themselves into the very soil of a community, subtly altering the way its people navigate their daily lives and conceptualize their own safety. In the extended aftermath of the 2010 shooting and the subsequent legal resolutions, the territory of American Samoa found itself grappling with a complex, silent epidemic of psychological trauma that rippled far beyond the immediate families of the victims. For a society that had historically relied on its isolation and profound cultural interconnectedness to ward off extreme violence of the outside world, the execution of Detective Lucilla Brown served as a brutal, inescapable awakening. The citizens of Pago Pago, particularly those present at the High Court that afternoon, were forced to process a level of acute vulnerability that was entirely foreign to their collective experience. The realization that an individual could harbor such deep-seated malice and execute a premeditated assassination in broad daylight shattered the foundational assumption of mutual trust that had defined island life for generations. This psychological shift was not something that could be remedied by the installation of metal detectors or the arming of the police force. It required a profound, agonizing period of cultural mourning and cognitive recalibration as the community learned to reconcile its cherished traditions of openness with the harsh, modern imperative of constant vigilance. This pervasive sense of loss extended deeply into the traditional mechanisms of dispute resolution that had long served as the bedrock of the Samoan social order. The system of the Matai, the village chiefs who possess the moral and cultural authority to mediate conflicts and prevent the escalation of violence, faced an unprecedented philosophical challenge in the wake of the shooting. The tragedy demonstrated that there were boundaries to the efficacy of traditional diplomacy, highlighting the terrifying reality that certain manifestations of personal grievance could completely bypass the established channels of community mediation. The Matai were forced to adapt their leadership strategies to account for a world where the unwritten rules of respect could be so easily discarded by a single individual armed with a concealed weapon. While the FA Samoa remained the guiding light of the territory, its custodians had to acknowledge that cultural deterrence alone was no longer an absolute guarantee of peace. This realization brought a new layer of gravity to the responsibilities of the village leaders, who now had to work in closer, more pragmatic tandem with the modernized, armed law enforcement apparatus to identify and neutralize potential threats before they could metastasize into irreversible violence. The delicate equilibrium between traditional authority and formal, state-sanctioned security was permanently altered, requiring a continuous, careful negotiation to ensure that the soul of the culture was not entirely consumed by the mechanics of modern policing. The physical landscape of the capital city also bore the enduring scars of the tragedy, most notably in the transformation and eventual legacy of the GHC Reed building itself. Prior to the events of July 2010, the structure had been a bustling, unremarkable hub of administrative and judicial activity, a place where the community gathered to witness the peaceful administration of justice. In the years following the shooting, however, the building became a solemn, unavoidable monument to the fragility of that peace. Even as it transitioned back to its original functions, the space was forever marked by the memory of the violence that had occurred on its threshold. The presence of advanced security screening equipment and armed guards at the entrance served as a daily, physical reminder of the specific afternoon when the territory's innocence was violently stripped away. For many residents, walking past the site or entering the facility evoked a complex mixture of sorrow, resilience, and an underlying, persistent anxiety. The building transformed from a simple structure of governance into a complex symbol of the territory's historical dividing line, a physical representation of the before and the after, standing as a silent witness to the profound costs associated with the modernization of island security. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond the shores of American Samoa, serving as a stark, cautionary tale for other remote, tight-knit communities across the Pacific and around the world. The assassination of Detective Brown highlighted a universal vulnerability inherent in any society that relies excessively on social contracts and geographic isolation to maintain its security. Law enforcement agencies in similar territories were forced to reevaluate their own operational protocols, recognizing that the assumption of perpetual peace could be a fatal operational blind spot. The tragedy underscored the necessity of preparing for the absolute worst-case scenarios, even in environments where extreme violence seems historically impossible or culturally unimaginable. It demonstrated that the tools of modern law enforcement, including firearms and advanced tactical training, are not merely instruments of oppression or urbanization, but essential mechanisms of protection that must be available to officers who are tasked with safeguarding the public. The hard-learned lessons of Pago Pago reverberated through police academies and administrative offices in distant island nations, prompting a wave of proactive security enhancements designed to prevent a similar catastrophe from shattering another peaceful community. Furthermore, the protracted, highly complex legal saga that followed the shooting exposed significant vulnerabilities within the judicial infrastructure of unincorporated territories. The initial pursuit of the death penalty and the subsequent realization that the territory completely lacked the capacity to execute such a sentence highlighted the profound disconnect between the theoretical severity of the law and the practical realities of island governance. The case forced legal scholars and policymakers to confront the unique challenges of administering justice in jurisdictions that operate at the intersection of local tradition and federal constitutional mandates. The years of procedural gridlock, caused by defense attorney turnover and logistical hurdles, demonstrated the immense strain that a high-profile, resource-intensive homicide prosecution can place on a small, geographically isolated court system. The eventual resolution of the case through a negotiated plea agreement, while providing necessary legal finality, also served as a pragmatic acknowledgement of these systemic limitations, prioritizing absolute certainty of punishment over the unpredictable and exhausting mechanics of a multi-year capital trial. As the years turned into a decade, and the immediate shock of the tragedy slowly gave way to the steady rhythms of historical memory, the narrative of Detective Lucilla Brown evolved from a story of victimization into a powerful legacy of public service and ultimate sacrifice. The territory of American Samoa refused to allow his memory to be defined solely by the brutal manner of his death. Instead, his life and career were elevated as the ultimate standard of dedication for the law enforcement community. Memorial services and commemorative events ensured that his name remained an active, revered presence in the public consciousness, a constant reminder of the immense courage required to stand on the front lines of community protection. The younger generations of officers, many of whom were only children when the shooting occurred, are now instructed in the history of his service, learning that the badge they wear carries a profound, historical weight. They are taught that the firearms they carry are not symbols of power, but solemn instruments of defense, adopted specifically because of the sacrifice made by an unarmed detective who refused to abandon his post in the face of absolute danger. The surviving officers, Sergeant Lou Fufatu and Detective Bonnie Lemigio, also assumed roles of immense symbolic importance within the territory's narrative of resilience. Their physical survival was a testament to medical intervention, but their emotional and professional endurance became a source of profound inspiration for the entire community. They represented the living embodiment of the department's refusal to surrender to fear. By continuing their lives and maintaining their commitment to the principles of justice, they demonstrated that while malice can inflict catastrophic damage, it cannot extinguish the fundamental courage of those who are sworn to protect others. Their actions on the pavement of Malaloa, rushing toward a lethal threat without the protection of firearms, remain etched in the institutional memory of the police force as the purest expression of duty. Their legacy, intertwined forever with that of Detective Brown, ensures that the history of that day is not just a chronicle of violence, but a profound testament to the extraordinary bravery that ordinary individuals can summon in the darkest of moments. In the final analysis, the story of the 2010 shooting at the High Court of American Samoa is a profound meditation on the inescapable complexities of human nature and the inherent fragility of societal peace. It is a narrative that forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that no community, regardless of its geographic isolation, its cultural harmony, or its deep religious devotion, is entirely immune to the destructive potential of an unresolved personal grievance. The tragedy stripped away the illusion of absolute sanctuary, demanding that the territory mature into a new, more guarded phase of its existence. Yet, in the face of this profound loss of innocence, the islands did not collapse into a state of permanent cynicism or pervasive fear. Instead, they adapted, balancing the harsh, necessary logistics of modern security with the enduring, compassionate principles of the FA Samoa. The people of Pago Pago learned to lock their doors and fortify their institutions, but they did not close their hearts to one another. They built a stronger, more resilient foundation for their future, ensuring that the peace they cherish is now protected not just by tradition, but by the vigilant, unwavering dedication of a police force that will never again be caught defenseless in the line of duty. To truly comprehend the legacy of the tragedy that unfolded in the summer of 2010, one must look beyond court transcripts and legislative reforms and peer into the very soul of the islands today. As the years have woven themselves into the fabric of history, the physical remnants of the shooting at the temporary High Court have been systematically erased or absorbed by the relentless march of time and modernization. The concrete where the veteran detective drew his final breath has been scrubbed clean, paved over, and integrated into the fortified architecture of a society that refuses to be caught defenseless a second time. Yet the absence of physical bloodstains does not equate to the absence of memory. In American Samoa, memory is not merely a passive recording of past events. It is an active, living entity, passed down through the generations via the oral traditions of the AGA and the solemn histories taught within the police academy. The story of what happened on that fateful Thursday afternoon has become a foundational mythos for the modern era of the territory, a stark dividing line that separates the age of innocent vulnerability from the epoch of pragmatic, armed vigilance. It is a narrative whispered with reverence in the corridors of power and discussed with somber reflection in the village councils, ensuring that the heavy price paid for the modernization of island security is never forgotten or diminished by the comfort of passing decades. The evolution of the territorial police force in the years following the resolution of the legal proceedings stands as a visible monument to this enduring memory. The department that patrols the coastal roads and mountainous interiors of Pago Pago today is unrecognizable from the unarmed, vulnerable agency that existed prior to the assassination. The transition to an armed law enforcement model was not merely a logistical upgrade involving the procurement of firearms and tactical gear. It was a profound cultural and psychological metamorphosis. The contemporary officer must navigate a complex duality, acting simultaneously as a lethal guardian of the state and a compassionate, culturally fluent mediator bound by the ancient principles of the FA Samoa. They carry the physical weight of their service weapons as a solemn oath to the public and a permanent tribute to the colleague who is executed simply for standing his ground without one. The academy curriculum now intertwines intensive ballistic training and active shooter response drills with deep immersion into the traditional methods of community conflict resolution, creating a hybrid form of policing uniquely adapted to the specific challenges of the South Pacific. This new generation of officers understands that true safety requires both the hardware of modern defense and the software of cultural empathy, a balance forged directly in the crucible of the 2010 tragedy. This transformation forces a broader philosophical reflection on the nature of safety and sanctuary in an increasingly interconnected global landscape. For centuries, the remote islands of the Pacific were viewed as natural fortresses, insulated from the systemic violence and social decay that plagued the sprawling metropolises of the mainland. The tragedy at the High Court shattered this romanticized illusion, demonstrating with brutal clarity that human malice is not bound by geography and that isolation alone cannot deter a heart consumed by personal grievance. The territory was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that sanctuary is not an inherent right granted by nature, but a fragile construct that must be actively protected. The installation of metal detectors, the deployment of armed patrols, and the permanent fortification of government facilities represent a collective admission that the innocence of the past can never be fully reclaimed. Instead, the community has embraced a mature, resilient form of vigilance, recognizing that the preservation of their peaceful way of life demands a constant state of preparedness against the sudden intrusion of chaos. They have learned that true peace is not the absence of danger, but the capacity to confront and neutralize it before it can destroy the foundations of society. The personal devastation endured by the family of the fallen detective remains the profound core of this historical narrative. While the government rebuilt its security infrastructure and the public eventually returned to the routines of daily life, The void left behind in the victim's household is a chasm that no amount of legislation or judicial finality can ever truly fill. He was not just a uniformed officer performing a designated function. He was a beloved patriarch, a source of unwavering stability, and a deeply respected member of his village hierarchy. The transition of his legacy from a private familial grief to a public symbol of sacrifice requires an immense, continuous burden of emotional endurance from his loved ones. Every time a new class of police recruits is sworn in, every time a public official speaks of the necessity of the armed force, his family is forced to revisit the agonizing circumstances of his departure. Yet, they carry this burden with a quiet, extraordinary dignity that mirrors the character of the man they lost. Their resilience serves as a powerful testament to the strength of the Samoan family structure, proving that even catastrophic losses can be integrated into a narrative of honorable sacrifice that continues to protect and inspire the community long after the initial tears have dried. In stark contrast to the enduring reverence afforded to the victim, the fate of the perpetrator serves as a grim conclusion to the mechanics of territorial justice. Confined to the rigid, heavily monitored environment of the federal penitentiary system, he exists entirely removed from the warmth, freedom, and cultural richness of the islands he permanently altered. The consecutive life sentences handed down by the court were designed not merely as a punitive measure, but as an absolute guarantee of societal protection, ensuring that the individual responsible for shattering the peace of American Samoa will never again walk its shores or breathe its ocean air. His complete isolation from the community stands as the ultimate consequence for his rejection of the fundamental values that bind the territory together. While the islands continue to heal, evolve, and navigate the complexities of the future, he is permanently anchored to the moment of his crime, a cautionary figure whose actions resulted in the forfeiture of his own freedom and the complete transformation of the society he sought to disrupt. The implications of this case extend deeply into true crime history, offering a narrative that subverts the traditional tropes of the genre. This is not a story of a mysterious serial killer terrorizing an urban sprawl, nor is it a complex whodunit reliant on microscopic forensic clues and convoluted timelines. Instead, it is a chilling exploration of how a single, premeditated act of violence, executed in broad daylight for personal reasons, can unravel the institutional safety of a society. It forces the observer to examine the fragile agreements that hold communities together and the terrifying speed with which those agreements can be violated. The execution outside the High Court is a masterclass in the destructive potential of an unresolved grievance, illustrating how an individual can exploit the trusting nature of an undefended environment to enact a devastating toll. For those who study the mechanics of crime and societal response, the events in Pago Pago provide an invaluable case study in the rapid evolution of security protocols and the deep costs associated with the loss of institutional innocence. The sheer resilience of the Samoan culture emerges as the most powerful element of the narrative. The islands were subjected to a shock that could have easily fractured a less cohesive society, breeding widespread paranoia, institutional distrust, and an irreversible breakdown of communal harmony. Yet, the core principles of the territory refused to shatter under the weight of the violence. The village chiefs continued to guide their people with wisdom and steady hands. The churches remained packed with congregants seeking spiritual solace and collective strength, and the intricate networks of extended families provided an unbreakable safety net of emotional support. The community absorbed the blow, grieved openly, and then set about the arduous task of rebuilding their security without surrendering their soul. They accepted the metal detectors and armed police officers not as symbols of defeat, but as necessary tools to protect the cultural heritage they hold so dear. This ability to adapt to a harsh modern reality while fiercely guarding their ancestral identity is the true triumph of American Samoa. The final chapter of this saga is written not in the archives of the court or legislative records, but in the quiet, everyday moments of peace that now define the territory. When the sun sets over the rugged peaks of the island and the Pacific waters gently lap against the shores of Malaloa, the heightened security measures fade into the background of a society that continues to thrive in its isolated corner of the world. The officers who patrol the streets do so with a vigilance born of tragedy, their presence a silent promise that the vulnerability of the past has been permanently rectified. They stand watch over a community that has learned the hardest lessons about the fragility of safety, but which remains fundamentally defined by its warmth, its faith, and its unbreakable bonds of kinship. The legacy of the veteran detective who gave his life on that pavement is woven into this restored peace, a permanent, protective spirit that continues to watch over the islands. His sacrifice forced a painful but necessary evolution, ensuring that the sanctuary of American Samoa remains a place of profound beauty, deep resilience, and enduring, hard-won peace. To truly comprehend the legacy of the tragedy that unfolded in the summer of 2010, one must look beyond court transcripts and legislative reforms and peer into the very soul of the islands today. As the years have woven themselves into the fabric of history, the physical remnants of the shooting at the temporary High Court have been systematically erased or absorbed by the relentless march of time and modernization. The concrete where the veteran detective drew his final breath has been scrubbed clean, paved over, and integrated into the fortified architecture of a society that refuses to be caught defenseless a second time. Yet the absence of physical bloodstains does not equate to the absence of memory. In American Samoa, memory is not merely a passive recording of past events. It is an active, living entity, passed down through the generations via the oral traditions of the AGA and the solemn histories taught within the police academy. The story of what happened on that fateful Thursday afternoon has become a foundational mythos for the modern era of the territory, a stark dividing line that separates the age of innocent vulnerability from the epoch of pragmatic, armed vigilance. It is a narrative whispered with reverence in the corridors of power and discussed with somber reflection in the village councils, ensuring that the heavy price paid for the modernization of island security is never forgotten or diminished by the comfort of passing decades. The evolution of the territorial police force in the years following the resolution of the legal proceedings stands as a visible monument to this enduring memory. The department that patrols the coastal roads and mountainous interiors of Pago Pago today is unrecognizable from the unarmed, vulnerable agency that existed prior to the assassination. The transition to an armed law enforcement model was not merely a logistical upgrade involving the procurement of firearms and tactical gear. It was a profound cultural and psychological metamorphosis. The contemporary officer must navigate a complex duality, acting simultaneously as a lethal guardian of the state and a compassionate, culturally fluent mediator bound by the ancient principles of the FA Samoa. They carry the physical weight of their service weapons as a solemn oath to the public and a permanent tribute to the colleague who is executed simply for standing his ground without one. The academy curriculum now intertwines intensive ballistic training and active shooter response drills with deep immersion into the traditional methods of community conflict resolution, creating a hybrid form of policing uniquely adapted to the specific challenges of the South Pacific. This new generation of officers understands that true safety requires both the hardware of modern defense and the software of cultural empathy, a balance forged directly in the crucible of the 2010 tragedy. This transformation forces a broader philosophical reflection on the nature of safety and sanctuary in an increasingly interconnected global landscape. For centuries, the remote islands of the Pacific were viewed as natural fortresses, insulated from the systemic violence and social decay that plagued the sprawling metropolises of the mainland. The tragedy at the High Court shattered this romanticized illusion, demonstrating with brutal clarity that human malice is not bound by geography and that isolation alone cannot deter a heart consumed by personal grievance. The territory was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that sanctuary is not an inherent right granted by nature, but a fragile construct that must be actively protected. The installation of metal detectors, the deployment of armed patrols, and the permanent fortification of government facilities represent a collective admission that the innocence of the past can never be fully reclaimed. Instead, the community has embraced a mature, resilient form of vigilance, recognizing that the preservation of their peaceful way of life demands a constant state of preparedness against the sudden intrusion of chaos. They have learned that true peace is not the absence of danger, but the capacity to confront and neutralize it before it can destroy the foundations of society. The personal devastation endured by the family of the fallen detective remains the profound core of this historical narrative. While the government rebuilt its security infrastructure and the public eventually returned to the routines of daily life, the void left behind in the victim's household is a chasm that no amount of legislation or judicial finality can ever truly fill. He was not just a uniformed officer performing a designated function. He was a beloved patriarch, a source of unwavering stability, and a deeply respected member of his village hierarchy. The transition of his legacy from a private familial grief to a public symbol of sacrifice requires an immense, continuous burden of emotional endurance from his loved ones. Every time a new class of police recruits is sworn in, every time a public official speaks of the necessity of the armed force, his family is forced to revisit the agonizing circumstances of his departure. Yet, they carry this burden with a quiet, extraordinary dignity that mirrors the character of the man they lost. Their resilience serves as a powerful testament to the strength of the Samoan family structure, proving that even catastrophic losses can be integrated into a narrative of honorable sacrifice that continues to protect and inspire the community long after the initial tears have dried. In stark contrast to the enduring reverence afforded to the victim, the fate of the perpetrator serves as a grim conclusion to the mechanics of territorial justice. Confined to the rigid, heavily monitored environment of the federal penitentiary system, he exists entirely removed from the warmth, freedom, and cultural richness of the islands he permanently altered. The consecutive life sentences handed down by the court were designed not merely as a punitive measure, but as an absolute guarantee of societal protection, ensuring that the individual responsible for shattering the peace of American Samoa will never again walk its shores or breathe its ocean air. His complete isolation from the community stands as the ultimate consequence for his rejection of the fundamental values that bind the territory together. While the islands continue to heal, evolve, and navigate the complexities of the future, he is permanently anchored to the moment of his crime, a cautionary figure whose actions resulted in the forfeiture of his own freedom and the complete transformation of the society he sought to disrupt. The implications of this case extend deeply into true crime history, offering a narrative that subverts the traditional tropes of the genre. This is not a story of a mysterious serial killer terrorizing an urban sprawl, nor is it a complex whodunit reliant on microscopic forensic clues and convoluted timelines. Instead, it is a chilling exploration of how a single, premeditated act of violence, executed in broad daylight for personal reasons, can unravel the institutional safety of a society. It forces the observer to examine the fragile agreements that hold communities together and the terrifying speed with which those agreements can be violated. The execution outside the High Court is a masterclass in the destructive potential of an unresolved grievance, illustrating how an individual can exploit the trusting nature of an undefended environment to enact a devastating toll. For those who study the mechanics of crime and societal response, the events in Pago Pago provide an invaluable case study in the rapid evolution of security protocols and the deep costs associated with the loss of institutional innocence. The sheer resilience of the Samoan culture emerges as the most powerful element of the narrative. The islands were subjected to a shock that could have easily fractured a less cohesive society, breeding widespread paranoia, institutional distrust, and an irreversible breakdown of communal harmony. Yet, the core principles of the territory refused to shatter under the weight of the violence. The village chiefs continued to guide their people with wisdom and steady hands. The churches remained packed with congregants seeking spiritual solace and collective strength, and the intricate networks of extended families provided an unbreakable safety net of emotional support. The community absorbed the blow, grieved openly, and then set about the arduous task of rebuilding their security without surrendering their soul. They accepted the metal detectors and armed police officers not as symbols of defeat, but as necessary tools to protect the cultural heritage they hold so dear. This ability to adapt to a harsh modern reality while fiercely guarding their ancestral identity is the true triumph of American Samoa. The final chapter of this saga is written not in the archives of the court or legislative records, but in the quiet, everyday moments of peace that now define the territory. When the sun sets over the rugged peaks of the island and the Pacific waters gently lap against the shores of Malaloa, the heightened security measures fade into the background of a society that continues to thrive in its isolated corner of the world. The officers who patrol the streets do so with a vigilance born of tragedy, their presence a silent promise that the vulnerability of the past has been permanently rectified. They stand watch over a community that has learned the hardest lessons about the fragility of safety, but which remains fundamentally defined by its warmth, its faith, and its unbreakable bonds of kinship. The legacy of the veteran detective who gave his life on that pavement is woven into this restored peace, a permanent, protective spirit that continues to watch over the islands. His sacrifice forced a painful but necessary evolution, ensuring that the sanctuary of American Samoa remains a place of profound beauty, deep resilience, and enduring, hard-won peace. To provide a final, encompassing perspective on the legacy of Detective Lucilla Brown, one must understand that the true conclusion of this story is not found in the finality of a prison sentence, but in the ongoing, quiet resilience of a territory that refused to be defined by its darkest day. Over the years, the shadow of the 2010 shooting has shifted from a source of acute communal trauma into a foundational lesson in the necessity of protective vigilance within a modern society. The islands of American Samoa continue to thrive, their volcanic peaks and azure waters remaining as breathtaking as they were before the tragedy, yet there is a newfound depth to the peace that settles over the harbor of Pago Pago. It is a peace that is no longer naive or unexamined. It is a hard-won tranquility that acknowledges the existence of human malice while choosing to prioritize the safety of those who stand on the front lines of justice. The transformation of the High Court from an open, vulnerable facility into a fortified institution of law serves as a permanent architectural tribute to the reality that some cultural shifts, however painful, are essential for the survival of the collective whole. Within the ranks of the American Samoa Police Department, the memory of July 22, 2010, remains the definitive benchmark for professional integrity and sacrifice. Every officer who now laces up their boots and fastens their service weapon does so with an inherent understanding of the specific event that made such equipment a mandatory requirement of the job. The department has successfully integrated the rigorous demands of modern, armed law enforcement with the traditional nuances of island culture, creating a unique model of policing that values both tactical preparedness and empathetic community engagement. They are the living legacy of Lucilla Brown, carrying forward the dignity and dedication he displayed for 19 years, but now possessing the defensive tools that he was tragically denied. This professional evolution ensures that his death was not in vain, but rather the catalyst for a systemic fortification that has likely saved countless lives in the years since the suspect was led away in handcuffs. The department has become a stronger, more resilient organization, one that honors its fallen by ensuring that its current members are never again forced to face a lethal threat with nothing but their courage. The broader Samoan community has also demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for healing, proving that the bonds of family and faith are stronger than any act of individual violence. The traditional ceremonies of the Ega and the spiritual guidance of the village churches provided the necessary framework for the territory to process its grief without descending into permanent fear or social fragmentation. The islands did not become a closed, paranoid society. Instead, they became a more aware and prepared one. The people of American Samoa still celebrate their vibrant heritage, still gather for communal feasts, and still rely on the wisdom of the Matai to resolve the vast majority of their disputes. They have managed to preserve the soul of their culture while accepting the necessary boundaries of modern security, a delicate balance that serves as a model for other close-knit societies around the globe. The resilience displayed by the citizens of Pago Pago is the ultimate redemption of the story, a confirmation that the values of respect and community can survive even the most brutal violation of the social contract. For the family of the fallen detective, the passage of more than a decade has transformed their private mourning into a source of immense public pride. They have witnessed their personal loss become the cornerstone of a safer territory, seeing the name of their patriarch etched into the very fabric of the island's history. His sacrifice is discussed not as a tragedy to be hidden, but as a standard of service to be emulated by every public servant. The quiet dignity with which they have navigated the years of legal gridlock and the eventual finality of the sentencing has earned them the enduring respect of the entire territory. They remain the most powerful witnesses to the man behind the badge, ensuring that the world remembers not just the detective who fell, but the father, the husband, and the community leader who lived a life of profound meaning and purpose. Their strength is the final, unassailable proof that the impact of a good man's life far outlasts the destructive reach of a single, violent act. The fate of the perpetrator, meanwhile, remains a closed chapter in the archives of the federal justice system. His life of permanent isolation within the walls of a distant penitentiary stands as a silent, unyielding reminder of the consequences of choosing personal vengeance over the collective peace of the community. He is a figure of the past, his influence over the islands permanently terminated by the unswerving hand of the law. His attempt to disrupt the order of American Samoa ultimately failed, as the territory responded by becoming more unified, more protected, and more resolute in its commitment to the rule of law. The consecutive life sentences ensure that he remains a memory of a dark moment, while the society he sought to harm continues to grow, evolve, and prosper in the light of its own resilience. The finality of his punishment is the baseline upon which the ongoing story of the islands is written, providing the necessary closure for the wounds of 2010 to finally, fully heal. In the final analysis, the story of the shooting at the High Court of American Samoa is a testament to the inescapable reality of change and the profound strength required to manage it. It is a narrative that begins with a devastating violation of a peaceful sanctuary and ends with the emergence of a more robust, vigilant, and unified community. The legacy of Detective Lucilla Brown is not found in the violence that ended his life, but in the permanent safety he secured for those who followed in his footsteps. The islands remain a place of extraordinary beauty and deep tradition, now guarded by a sophisticated network of security that honors the memory of the man who stood unarmed at the gate. As the warm Pacific sun sets over the harbor, the territory of American Samoa stands as a beacon of hard-won peace, a society that looked into the abyss of a senseless crime and chose to build a future defined by courage, justice, and an unbreakable commitment to one another. The story of 2010 is closed, but the legacy of the hero it produced will continue to watch over the islands for generations to come. As we reach the final destination of this narrative journey, we are forced to look beyond the mechanics of a crime and the structure of the laws to consider the ultimate spiritual and cultural equilibrium of American Samoa. The tragedy of 2010 did not just change the way the police were armed or the way buildings were secured. It forced a deep, collective meditation on the nature of forgiveness and the endurance of the human spirit within a confined geographic space. In a territory where you are likely to cross paths with the relatives of both the victim and the perpetrator in the local market or at a community gathering, the process of healing takes on a dimension of complexity that is almost impossible to grasp in the context of the American mainland. The peace that exists today in Pago Pago is not a passive or a fragile state, but a conscious, daily choice made by a people who understand that their survival depends on their ability to maintain social cohesion despite the scars of the past. The legacy of Detective Lucilla Brown is the ultimate glue for this cohesion, providing a shared point of reference for what it means to serve with honor and what it means to lose with dignity. He remains the silent guardian of the islands, a presence that is felt in the calm of the courtroom and the steady gaze of the officers who now stand watch where he once stood. This enduring sense of community balance is the very foundation upon which the future of the territory will be constructed. This balance remains the territory's foundation. The professionalization of the American Samoa Police Department in the years following the case has created a new standard for law enforcement across the entire South Pacific region. Other island nations, observing the profound transformation that occurred in the wake of the shooting, have looked to Pago Pago as a case study in how to modernize a security force while respecting traditional cultural boundaries. The department has become a hub of expertise, sharing lessons on tactical preparedness, witness protection, and the integration of federal and local legal frameworks. This regional influence is a direct extension of the sacrifice made by Detective Brown, turning a local tragedy into a catalyst for broader regional stability. The officers who now graduate from the Territorial Academy do so with a global perspective, understanding that they are part of a larger mission to ensure that no other community is left as vulnerable as theirs once was. They carry the history of 2010 not as a burden of fear, but as a mandate for excellence, ensuring that the shield they wear is backed by both the strength of their training and the depth of their character. Their professionalism serves as a beacon of hope for all remote jurisdictions facing the encroaching complexities of the modern world. Their professionalism is a beacon for all remote jurisdictions. The physical monuments that have been erected in honor of Detective Brown and the heroism of Sergeant Fufatu and Detective Lemigio serve as permanent, tangible anchors for the territory's collective memory. These sites are not places of mourning, but places of inspiration, where the youth of the islands can learn about the values of sacrifice, duty, and the high cost of maintaining a peaceful society. To see a young person standing before a memorial plaque in Pago Pago is to see the transmission of a historical consciousness that will protect the islands long after the current generation of leaders has passed. These monuments ensure that the names of those who stood their ground on that hot July afternoon are never lost to the eroding tides of time. They provide a physical space for the community to reaffirm its commitment to the rule of law and the sanctity of life, acting as a constant, quiet reminder that the safety they enjoy today was bought with the courage of those who refused to back down in the face of an unprecedented threat. These physical markers are essential for the preservation of the truth in an age of digital distraction and fleeting memories. These markers are essential for the preservation of truth. Furthermore, the legacy of the case has prompted a deeper exploration of the psychological and social factors that can lead to such a profound rupture in the social contract. The territory has invested in expanded community outreach programs and mental health resources, aiming to identify and address the root causes of personal grievances before they can escalate into the kind of toxic animosity that fueled the 2010 shooting. This proactive approach is a direct response to the revelation that the assassination was something personal, a recognition that the security of the islands depends as much on the emotional well-being of its citizens as it does on the arming of its police. By fostering an environment where individuals feel heard and where conflicts are addressed with both traditional wisdom and modern psychological insight, American Samoa is building a more holistic form of protection. This effort to heal the hidden fractures within the community is perhaps the most profound tribute to Detective Brown, as it seeks to create a world where the kind of violence that claimed his life is no longer seen as a viable option for resolving a personal dispute. This effort is a profound tribute to Detective Brown's life. As the sun sets over the rugged peaks of Tutuila and the stars begin to reflect in the calm waters of the harbor, the story of Lucilla Brown reaches its natural resting place. The islands have moved through the fire of tragedy and emerged with a tempered, more resilient peace. The metal detectors and the armed officers are no longer symbols of a broken trust, but symbols of a community that has matured enough to protect what it loves. The laughter of children playing on the shore and the quiet conversations of elders on their porches are the ultimate sounds of victory over the chaos that attempted to seize the islands 16 years ago. The territory remains a sanctuary, but it is now a sanctuary with eyes wide open, a place where tradition and vigilance walk hand in hand. The detective who stood unarmed outside the court is gone, but the security he secured through his sacrifice remains as solid as the volcanic rock beneath the islands. The sanctuary remains as solid as rock. The narrative of July 22, 2010, is now a permanent thread in the grand tapestry of American Samoa, a thread of darkness that served to highlight the overwhelming strength and brilliance of the surrounding culture. It is a story that will be told as long as there are people to listen, a chronicle of a hero, a villain, and a community that chose to rise above the violence. The legacy of Detective Brown is a light that continues to shine in every corner of the territory, guiding the way toward a future where justice is served, duty is honored, and peace is protected with every breath. As the Pacific tides continue their eternal cycle, They carry with them the memory of a man who gave everything for his home, and the knowledge that because of him, that home is safer, stronger, and more unified than ever before. The story of the GHC Reed building is no longer one of death, but of the enduring life of a people who refuse to be broken. It is a final testament to the power of resilience and the immortality of a life lived in service to others. In the final moments of this reflection, we are left with a sense of profound gratitude for the life of Lucilla Brown and the lessons his sacrifice has provided. He was a man of his time and his place, a true son of the islands who embodied the very best of the FA Samoa. His 19 years of unarmed service were not a failure of policy, but a triumph of character, a demonstration of what is possible when a human being operates from a place of absolute integrity and love for their community. The fact that his life ended in violence does not diminish the peace he spent nearly 2 decades building. Rather, it underscores the value of that peace and the necessity of guarding it with everything we have. He remains a hero in the truest sense of the word, an individual whose legacy has reshaped the world he left behind. The islands of American Samoa are his monument, and the continued safety of its people is his greatest achievement. He has found his rest, but his work continues in every officer who stands watch and every citizen who chooses the path of peace. This is the end of the script for this series, but the story of American Samoa and the legacy of Detective Brown is one that continues to unfold with every passing day. It is a living history, a narrative of transformation and triumph that will inspire for generations to come. As we close this chapter, we do so with a renewed appreciation for the fragility of our social contracts and the immense courage required to maintain them. We remember the detective, we honor the survivors, and we celebrate the resilience of a culture that turned a moment of absolute darkness into a legacy of enduring light. The Pacific waters remain calm, the islands remain strong, and the memory of Lucilla Brown remains a guiding star for all who believe in the power of justice and the resilience of the human spirit. The case is closed, the sentence is served, and the peace of the islands is restored, guarded now by the memory of a man who will never be forgotten. This was a story of American Samoa, and it is a story that will live forever in the heart of the South Pacific.